This is Atomic Shinobi, and today I'm going to narrate what if Naruto was neglected by his parents and turned evil. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Now, wasting no more time, let's start the story.
Deep within the shadowy walls of what had once been the arrogant and distinguished halls of the high heavens, the cries of misery and anguish erupted. Even as the burning hell's fires tore through the shattered remains of the diamond gates, which had never before been breached, there was only darkness where there had been light. The armies of the high heavens and the heavenly host resisted the impending assault of the infernal legions that dominated the burning hells. Ultimately, their battles were insignificant compared to the battle that was about to take place above them, in the center of the Silver City, the most significant location in the high heavens, which is believed to be the spine of the primordial being anew and the place where every last high heavens resident is sung into creation. The Arch of Crystal. The source of the power that passed through each and every one of the heavenly host's warriors is the Crystal Arch. This enormous spire is where the power that the angels and the heavenly host use originated. This sacred spire is the source of all light, and the Crystal Arch is the most revered and sacred location in the entire universe. It has been demonstrated that an angel may emerge when all of the angels are in time with the soft, melodic rhythm produced by the Crystal Arch. The greatest strength and greatest weakness of the high heavens is the Crystal Arch. The angels and the heavenly host will be helpless, their wings clipped, and they will be grounded if the arch is corrupted. The high heavens themselves will collapse if the arch collapses. The final high heavens savior ascended the grand staircase leading to the summit because of this fact. Each swing of their sword sliced through their foes, their armor clinking as their sword glowed with power. Before they kicked the demon off the edge of the great staircase and fell to their doom, the figure ducked under a swing that came from a tall and imposing demon. The demon roared in agony as they drove their sword deep into its chest. Without any delay, the figure rushed forward, slicing through the group of demons that were pouring down the stairs from the summit of the Crystal Arch. Two demons, aspects of terror, stood at the top of the stairway, flanking a magnificent knight-like figure. Their armor appeared to be made of demon bones, and their form cast an even deeper shadow than the one that was already there. The figure was taller than any ordinary man. The figure narrowed its eyes, their hellish red eyes glowing brighter as it gazed upon the warrior who had slayed the demons that swarmed against him. As they turned to face the formidable figure, the two aspects of terror on either side of him growled and hissed. In a callous but piercing voice, the demonic knight held up one hand and said, "Remove the aberration, swiftly." The two aspects of terror were on the stairway in less time than it took to blink, rushing at the figure that was killing their fellows. The demon, meanwhile, just watched with their arms crossed. The figure attempted to drive their weapon deep into the skull of a slobbering demon, but instead slammed their sword deep into the demon's chest. The figure was prepared to swing their sword once more after pushing the demon off of it. Slumbering as they attempted to ram their slavering jaw into their throat, they were flipped over when one of the aspects of terror leapt on them and knocked the sword out of their hands. The figure swore and grunted as they attempted to push the aspect of terror away from them, but the demon was just too determined to kill them. As they stalked forward slowly, the other aspect of terror roared and scampered from the sidelines, their claws appearing to grow in preparation for a sudden attack. The demon finally started to yield as the figure continued to push against it, allowing them to reach for their belt and unhitch a small dagger that glistened with a white smoky aura. The demon threw their head forward to try to kill the figure below them, and the figure let out a roar cry. The aspect of terror was instantly killed when the figure simultaneously drove the dagger upward, piercing through their upper jaw and straight through the top of their head. At this, the other aspect of terror screamed and jumped at the person who had killed its brother. Just as the demon swung its savage and oppressive claws at them, the figure with unrestricted use of their limbs reached out and grabbed the hilt of their fallen blade, swinging it. The demon lurched over with a cry of pain, and they turned to face their arm and the still, twitching limb that fell down the stairs. The figure pushed the dead demon away from them and turned to face the aspect of terror, who was now armed. They yowled in agony as their boiling, black blood spilled onto the stairs below. With his sword clenched tightly, the figure leapt at the demon, slicing the air with it. The demon turned to face the person who had severed its arm just in time to see the blade the figure was wielding before its vision went black as the gleaming blade cut the demon's skull from top to bottom. The demon could clearly hear the sound of the sword slicing through the tainted air of the high heavens. The demonic knight uncrossed his arms at the top of the stairway, his fingers clearly clenched. The figure simultaneously tore their sword from the demon's head and let its body fall down the stairs. They then looked up to the top of the staircase, where the demon knight was staring down at the person who had slain the two aspects of terror. "It is time for you to join your brothers in the burning hell's demon," said the figure, squinting their eyes. With a look that promised cruelty and punishment forever, the demonic knight merely gazed down at the figure. The figure scowled before starting up the stairs again. The staircase cracked as the demonic knight suddenly swung a massive war axe, blazing with unholy fire, at the figure, barely deflected by the figure's sword. Crash was the word that the figure had to dodge as the demonic knight leapt off the top of the stairs and crashed right where they had just been standing. Clang! As the two fighters pressed against one another, the clash of the two sharp edges sent blazing sparks flying. Take solace in the knowledge that you and the angels shall share the high heavens, as your tomb, the demon said, pressing their weapon against their opponent as the demonic knight grabbed the handle of their axe and pushed forward, pushing his opponent back in the process. Not before you. The figure growled, pushing back against the demon, and kicked it in the knee, causing it to bend back. The demon let go of their weapon and let out a painful howl. The warrior used the brief distraction to propel their blade forward and pierce the demonic knight's throat deeply. They staggered back, the blade slipping from their throat as they fell off the edge of the great staircase to the battle below, and the demon was silenced, leaving only the gurgling of blood. The figure stood for a moment, then pushed most of their blood off the blade with a flick of the wrist. Then, with their glowing dagger in the other hand, they turned to face the stairs that led upward. There was a frown on their face, a stern look in their eyes, and they hurried to the top of the stairs. To the crystal arch's summit. With their weapons ready, the warrior climbed to the last step and marched onto the platform. And as they exclaimed, "Diablo," their voice reverberated. They stood at the edge of the crystal arch's peak, examining and assessing the destruction their armies inflicted upon the shattered forces of the heavenly host, and it was there, on top of the crystal arch, that the source of the despair below saw the ruin of the high heavens. Entire citadels were in its line of sight, blazing as the burning hell's fires tore through the high heavens' fractured terraces and crossroads. Hundreds of angels were captured and killed, unable to defend themselves or stand up to their demonic overlords as their armor broke and their life force went out with it. This was the scene that Diablo had long longed for, the scene that the Lord of Terror saw, the scene that the Prime Evil witnessed, and the scene that the intruder behind him was interrupting. They were met with a dark chuckle and a dismissive look as Diablo slowly turned his head to face the warrior who had battled through his armies. "So, the Nephilim has Kamea," Diablo said. "It is over, Diablo. Today your evil, and the evil your entire race represents will fall, once and for all," the warrior of the Nephilim said, pointing their sword at Diablo as they stepped forward. Their voice reverberated across the terrace atop the crystal arch with such conviction and confidence that lesser men would shudder before the intensity of such a voice. Diablo was not a lesser man, however. The only answer from the Prime Evil was a dark, low laugh that only got louder until it reverberated throughout the crystal arch like a low rumble. The laughter was so strong that it shook the crystal arch, causing the Nephilim to lose their balance and fall to one knee. With a dark gleam of laughter in his eyes, Diablo turned to face the Nephilim and said, "I needed a proper vessel, one which could contain my power and more, and my servant was more than willing to sire me one. I required the power of all of the great evils, and you and your comrades handed it to me, locked in the black soulstone." Diablo then stopped laughing and started to walk along the edge of the arch, saying, "You haven't an inkling, Nephilim." Diablo held out his arm, one finger extended, then closed it into a fist. The Nephilim rose again, their hands gripping their weapons tighter, their teeth bared. "And here you are, having the gall to suggest that this day is my last?" Diablo said, raising his arms in the air and pointing to the flaming high heavens. "Look around you, Nephilim. Look upon the burning remnants of the high heavens, broken and divided." Diablo turned to face the high heavens and said, "The high heavens, and the Angiras Council, leaderless since the worldstone shattered, and Malthael flayed at the once mighty Tyrael, fell from Gracia and Imperius." Diablo laughed and turned to face another flaming spire. With Diablo's back to him, the Nephilim roared into battle and charged. As the Nephilim swung their blade, the sword blazing with unearthly light, Diablo remained where he was. Their sword fell from his grasp and slid across the ground, well beyond their reach, as the Nephilim was knocked away and smashed into the crystal arch's walls. "The seven evils are one within me, Nephilim. Even if you somehow manage to kill off my forces, I alone am legion," Diablo snorted as he turned to face the Nephilim as they attempted to push themselves back up. "Then killing you will be 7 times the pleasure," the Nephilim exclaimed as he stood tall and grabbed his dagger before charging forward. Diablo inhaled deeply and roared loudly, "RWOOAAR." The ground beneath him was shattered by the shockwave as it rushed in the direction of the Nephilim. When the Nephilim saw the approaching wave, they leapt forward and swung their white, blazing dagger, cutting through the wave of devastation. Diablo growled and followed suit, slashing his arm quickly. As the Nephilim and Diablo fought for control, clang! A witch made contact with the Nephilim's dagger and a wave of light and darkness clashes with one another. With a snarl, Diablo swung their other arm toward the Nephilim, their blade poised to sever its flesh. When the Nephilim saw this, they pushed back against Diablo with all of their strength, avoiding the incoming blade that would have, at the very least, killed him or seriously wounded him. Growling and snarling, Diablo said, "Is that all, Nephilim?" Not even close yet. The Nephilim glared at Diablo. Fire crawled across Diablo's back, flowing upon the jagged spines before crawling over his shoulders and wrapping around his arms, while his eyes glowed with an unholy light and his mouth suddenly began to glow with a blistering inferno. Whatever Diablo threw at him, the Nephilim was ready with his dagger. Condensing into Diablo's hands, the fires created constantly shifting spheres of fire that swirled like a maelstrom. Diablo hurled the two balls of fire, which rushed toward the Nephilim, in a single instant. As the energy gathered in their palm, the Nephilim stiffened their stance and extended their arm, displaying glowing runes along its length. A beam of light erupted from the Nephilim's hand in an instant, tearing through the fire spheres and scattering them as it rushed in Diablo's direction. With a guttural growl, Diablo merely cut his claw against the beam of light, sending the light particles flying through the air and shattering it like glass. The runes on their arms glowed brighter as the Nephilim grinned. Boom! The prime evil roared in pain as the light particles suddenly exploded around him, sending him toppling over. Diablo's entire body was burned, and he lost his balance and fell backward onto his back. When the Nephilim noticed this, they looked quickly at their sword, which was resting on the terrace across from the arch. As Diablo slowly pushed himself up, they quickly turned their entire body and ran towards their fallen sword. Enough! Diablo roared, pushing himself to his knees as the Nephilim was halfway to the blade. He then threw his arm forward, sending a shockwave directly at the Nephilim. The Nephilim was about to leap to their sword for the last time when they were abruptly flung from their feet and collided with the tall pillars of the crystal arch. At this point, Diablo decided to stand up straight and said, "You have proven yourself a rather disdainful nuisance, Nephilim." The Nephilim rose and glared at Diablo, but something caught their attention. They turned their heads against their better judgment. And they widened their horrified eyes. Like a legion on horseback, the burning hell's flames crawled across the crystal arch's outer rim. With the burning hell's fires reacting to his whim, Diablo laughed and said, "Let us see if you are such a nuisance in my realm of terror." As the burning hell's fires ate away at the crystal arch, the Nephilim surveyed the area. Then they looked at their sword, which would soon be consumed by the flames. The Nephilim moved quickly in the direction of their sword, leaping for it and reaching for it. Suddenly, the sword's blade was encircled by the burning hell's fires. The Nephilim then encircled the hilt with their hand. The Nephilim got lost in a world of darkness. In the terrible realm, the Nephilim abruptly turned around and extended the hand they had used to grasp their sword as a dark chuckle reverberated through the darkness. Only to discover that the blade was missing from the sword they had seized. "What?" they exclaimed as they saw the hilt, which had once held their blade, now devoid of it. As a dark and terrible voice reverberated inside the Nephilim's head, the dark chuckle transformed into crushing laughter. "And how your terror begins, Nephilim. Trapped in my realm of terror, all of your fears shall be laid bare, embodied in physical form. Only by defeating us can you ever leave this place." The voice only grew more malicious, and the dark laughter grew softer. But none have ever crawled from the depths of their own terror, none ever will. Looking around, the Nephilim saw that the darkness was encroaching on them until they could no longer even make out the hilt of their former weapon. Behind them, they heard footsteps pattering, and they turned around at the sound. Only for their hand to go through a shattered face made of darkness. They cursed as they glanced around and then back down at their hand, where they could just make out the thin outline of their sword's hilt. It had been obvious that the fires of the burning hells had drawn them into the realm of terror. Somewhere in here must have been the blade of their sword. In the hopes that their sword's light could cut through the darkness, the Nephilim started scanning their surroundings. Looking for something. The shadow that had spoken was nowhere to be found when the Nephilim abruptly spun around and swung in its direction. A soft, human, laughter reverberated through the dark realm, and they gritted their teeth and roared in rage. The human laughter turned dark and evil, and they started running through the shadows, cursing. RWOOARR. Before the Nephilim ducked under a sweeping claw strike from the darkness, its eyes briefly widened. The Nephilim searched the area for the attack's origin. Then they recalled the appearance of the arm and claw. It resembled Diablo's arm, but it seemed to be made entirely of shadows. How tastes your fear, Nephalem? In search of any clue as to the location of the Lord of Terror, the Nephalem swung around, scanning left and right. Can you feel your death approaching, Nephalem? With enraged eyes, the Nephalem swung their arm out, seeing nothing at all in this hellish place. Tell me, Nephalem, do you fear death? I am not afraid of death, and I am not afraid of you, Diablo. The Nephalem yelled, frowning. The shadows parted before the Nephalem, and the voice in the darkness laughed ruthlessly. Oh, perhaps, but you are afraid of something, aren't you? You think so? The Nephalem snorted icily, clearly contemptuous. Think? No, I know, it is what I have always known, what I always will know of the greatest fear, of every last living being, in every single realm, Diablo said, his dark laughter erupting. The Nephilim's eyes narrowed as they peered through the darkness, and the shadows kept shifting in front of them. Only for the sight in front of them to cause them to widen once more. More than 2 decades ago, the demon hordes destroyed their ancient village. Your greatest fear is that after you have done, sacrificed, and destroyed, that even as you die, you will never have made a difference. As the shadows continued to separate and the ruins of their former village came into view, the Nephalem turned to look around. They were forced to face the trauma and memories they had suppressed over the years. Diablo laughed in the shadows. Do you remember, Nephalem? How my demons slaughtered your village like cattle, how your beloved family was ripped apart and burned to ashes. The memories played back to the front of their minds, and the Nephalem shuddered. As they destroyed her house, they witnessed demons tearing through their neighbors. They watched as the soldiers who were meant to defend them fled in terror, only to be crushed by flying demons. As the demons viciously consumed their flesh and bones, they witnessed their parents being torn to pieces, cut in half, and split in two. What did she do when they noticed their younger brother whimpering for assistance? She did nothing but watch as her baby brother was dragged away by the demons and whimper as she heard his cries as he was ripped to pieces. You will never wake from this nightmare, you will never defeat your own terror. No matter how powerful you have become, your strength, your Nephalem power, it is useless in this realm. As the shadows gathered behind her and Diablo's face started to form, she lowered herself slowly to her knees and gripped the hilt of her old sword tightly. So tell me, Nephalem, how does it feel, knowing that you have failed everyone who depended on you? Instead of responding to Diablo, she turned her gaze to her hands and the hilt of her sword. Diablo was correct, she was terrified that, given everything she had done, she would never be able to change anything. That fear was constantly taking over her thoughts, regardless of what she did or how many demons she vanquished. That fear persisted even after she vanquished Asmodon and Belial, and it only intensified when Diablo took control of Leah. But not anymore. She wouldn't allow Diablo to win, even if she passed away today. If she died, he would too. Time to die, Nephalima. Diablo laughed and raised a shadowy arm before lowering it. Suddenly, a silver blade erupted from the hilt of the Nephilim's sword, and the hilt itself glowed brightly. She ducked out of the way just as Diablo's claws were ready to rip through the Nephalem, then swung the sword, cutting his arm off and sending it scattering into the darkness. For a brief moment, Diablo's demon eyes widened before he noticed the sword's glint. He caught a glimpse of it glinting just before it was smashed through his head, through his top jaw, and through his bottom jaw. After driving the blade deeper, the Nephalem ripped it from her opponent's skull, splitting it in two with a war cry. The realm of terror started to fade away as the dark shape of Diablo burst into smoke. The Nephalem gazed down at their sword, which was so strong and colorful. Similar to her, she gripped harder and looked up, knowing that the fight was far from over and that she would be readied for whatever came her way when the realm of terror collapsed around her. Her inner monologue was interrupted when Diablo's hand sprang forward from the shattered shadows and encircled her throat, causing her to gasp in agony as her sword slipped from her grasp. Diablo's other hand caught it in midair before it hit the ground. Diablo picked her up and looked into her eyes as the Nephalem choked in agony. I suppose congratulations are in order. You are the first, Nephalem or otherwise, to have ever escaped the realm of terror. Diablo snorted as he looked down at the sword she had used against him. But I do wonder, would you have been as successful without this sword, Nephalem? He said, lifting the sword. Diablo then casually threw the sword over the edge of the crystal arch, where it fell into the battlefield below. No. The Nephalem stared in horror, but Diablo tightened his hold on her throat and laughed with a growl that was dark and throaty. Did you really think that you stood a chance against me, Nephalem? If I had wanted to kill you before, I would have destroyed you before you even reached the first step of the great staircase. Diablo dropped the Nephalem, causing her to gasp for air. He then pressed his foot against her chest, slowly crushing her until her eyes turned bloodshot. But a quick death is far too good for you, Nephalem. I want to make you suffer, I want to make you scream and beg for mercy. In fact, how about we start now? Before she could even catch her breath, Diablo swung his tail, the spikes along its length digging into her flesh as she was smashed across the ground and hurled into the crystal arch's walls. Diablo had quickly taken his foot off her chest. Diablo stomped her, grabbed her legs, and then viciously swung her around and smashed her into the ground as she struggled to push herself while coughing and wheezing in pain. As she attempted to reach for her dagger, she coughed up big globules of blood, but Diablo grabbed her arm and swung her back into the ground, twisting it out of position. She was bleeding on the ground when Diablo laughed and kicked her in the sides, rolling her onto her back while pressing his foot to her chest. As he continued to press against her chest, he felt her ribs crack, and as she gasped for air, her eyes almost popped out of their sockets. The blade on Diablo's arm glowed with his dark power as he swung it downward, aimed directly at the Nephilim's head. Diablo looked down upon her and laughed cruelly, saying, "All that you have known, all that you have loved, will now die with you, Nephilim." Sching. And, squelch, raw aghhh. Diablo staggered back as he reached up to grasp the sword in his eye, releasing the Nephilim from beneath him, only to be momentarily slowed down as he heard the unsheathing of a blade. Indescribable pain then ripped through his head as a sword tore through his eye. As the person wielding the sword exerted more pressure on the blade's driving force, the sword was driven deeper in. After roaring in agony, Diablo finally grabbed the blade, wielder's leg and ripped it off, flinging it far away from him while taking the sword with it. For the first time, Diablo's eyes widened in surprise as he raised the one eye he had left to see who was in front of him. Tyrell! He exclaimed in shock, seeing the former archangel standing in front of him after he had fallen from the sky and turned mortal. Or so he had thought. A hood-adorned Tyrael head and the sword Eldruin, which had been used to slay innumerable demons, was embodied in what so closely resembled its true glory. Tyrell stood before him, mortal in appearance, but he carried the beginning ropes of what he could tell were archangel wings. How are you as you are? You fell, Tyrell, how are you an archangel once again? He said in a voice full of hate and rage, vowing to punish the archangel of justice in front of him. Diablo growled as his damaged eye attempted to heal itself due to his unholy malice. Unlike my former lieutenant, Isuel, I fell willingly. I could return to the high heavens whenever I desired to, and so I have, Diablo, Tyrell said, scowling at Diablo with what was left of his face. If that is the case, then why are you not powerless like your breath? Diablo growled, covering his eyes and stifling his voice as three pillars of light burst before him. He glanced up again after a short while, and his eyes narrowed at what he saw. Archangel of Hope, Oriel. Archangel of Fate, Itharael. The fragmented remains of the Solarian, the Spear of Valor, are held in the hand of Imperius, Archangel of Valor. They were all holding their wings. In response to the scene in front of him, Diablo growled, saying, "So, it seems even with the corruption of the Crystal Arch, the archangels are not as powerless as I had thought. I should have expected this." With his sword out, Tyrell declared, "We are united against you, Diablo, even as the prime evil. You will not have your victory this day, we shall die before we allow you your victory." "So be it." Diablo growled at them before charging at them. Tyrell struck Diablo with his blade, but Diablo deflected it with the blades on his arms. As Imperius brought the tip of Solarian down and slashed it into Diablo's head crest, he flew into the air. As spheres of holy light formed in their hands, Oriel and Itharael stayed apart and started chanting in the high heavens tongue. Tyrell kept cutting at Diablo, but the Nephilim leapt over him and stabbed her with her dagger into the wound that Tyrell had just caused, which was still healing. "Rog!" Diablo screamed in rage, grabbing the Nephilim by their legs and attempting to toss them, but Imperius slashed at him after driving the tip of Solarian deep into Diablo's arm. Tyrell leapt back, and the Nephilim leapt off Diablo. Diablo growled and spun around to attack them, only for him to scream in pain as Oriel and Itharael jumped on top of him and hit him with the light spheres, which burned into his bone and flesh. Diablo's ribs and a portion of his lower jaw were exposed by the attack, and his arms were skinned and his bones were broken, pushing him back. Imperius spotted an opening and charged in. The Nephilim and Tyrell did the same. When Diablo attempted to hit them, they ducked out of his path and continued their assault. As Imperius stabbed into Diablo's remaining eye, Tyrell pushed Eldruin deep between his ribs. Just as his other eye was about to heal, the Nephilim charged a strong light through her arms as Diablo roared in pain. The runes along her arms glowed brightly as she leapt upon Diablo. Despite being aware of her impending attack, Diablo was unable to block or avoid her. Diablo was hurled backward, slamming so hard into the crystal arch's walls that they collapsed behind him, after the Nephalem struck the side of his face with such force that the ground beneath them cracked and crumbled. As his dark power struggled to heal his wounds, Diablo moaned in agony and tried to push himself up by holding onto the sides of the crystal arch. When Tyrell noticed Diablo getting to his feet, he dashed forward, his sword ready to strike what he hoped would be the last blow. Diablo inhaled deeply as his eyes opened, one of them healed, the other filled with his dark power. When Imperius noticed, he yelled, "Tyrell, no!" Tyrell didn't stop, and as his wings grew brighter and his face disappeared entirely under his hood, he leapt upon Diablo. And Diablo's mouth opened, releasing a thunderous roar that ripped through the crystal arch's top, slamming into Tyrell and sending him flying backwards. The same thing happened to Imperius, Oriel, and Itharael because they were unable to get out of the way. Despite managing to avoid the primary wave, the Nephalem was nevertheless hurled abruptly to the side. Diablo snarled, "Even united, you fall," and stomped forward, grabbing the nearest angel and lifting off the ground. Diablo then completely stood up. He was now squeezing Oriel, and she was moaning in agony as she attempted to free herself from his fingers. Diablo growled and lifted his arm, the blade lengthening on it, ready to swing. Sching. Before Diablo felt nothing at all, just Pina, he experienced a sudden weightlessness around his arm. Diablo let go of Oriel and roared in pain, holding on to the stump where his arm had been. He looked up at the person who had cut it off, his blood gushing. The other archangels looked at the same moment. Malthael was the first thing Oriel said. The Archangel of Wisdom, Malthael himself, was floating in midair with their weapon extended and covered in the blood that had once filled Diablo. With a roar of rage, Diablo attempted to seize the Archangel, but they disappeared and resurfaced with the other 4 archangels. With his wounds still healing slowly, Diablo snarled and gazed at them, his eyes burning with vengeful fury. Malthael rushed forward and extended his hand. After a moment, the other 4 archangels quickly followed his example. The archangels slashed, burned, and pounded into Diablo's flesh while he ducked and slashed at them. Oriel struck the side of his face as he slashed at Malthael again, who deflected it with his weapon. Diablo swung his tail at them and staggered back. Imperius stabbed the tip of Solarian deep into Diablo's face before flipping over Diablo's tail and disappearing in a cloud of light. Tyrell pursued and drove Eldruin into Diablo's shoulder with a knife. While the other 4 battered at his defenses, Itharael prepared a stream of light energy. Malthael nodded his head as he turned back to face Itharael. Itharael gave Diablo a nod as well and directed the stream of light at him. As Diablo turned to face the other archangels, they quickly moved aside, and the stream of light slammed into his chest, destroying his defenses. With their weapons ready, the archangels stood on either side of Itharael, waiting to strike. Panting, Diablo grabbed a fallen pillar and crushed it as he rose to his feet. His bones were harmed by the stream of light, but he was rapidly recovering thanks to his demonic power. The Nephalem off to the side saw the battle coming and swore while searching for a weapon. To her ire, however, all of her weapons were either lost or had been used up. The archangels weren't holding back either, and they hadn't been able to hurt Diablo enough to keep him down thus far. She continued to look around, cursing, thinking that the high heavens would descend if they didn't defeat Diablo quickly. However, what might be sufficient to deliver the fatal blow? In that moment, she noticed Diablo's severed arm to the side, with a blade on the back of it that Diablo had used to block Eldruin and numerous other blows directed at him. She ran to the severed arm, looking deeply and intensely, and quickly tried to rip the blade off, which proved to be more difficult than she had anticipated. Tyrell turned to the others and said, "Keep him busy." After realizing her plan and seeing what she was doing, he then rushed off to help the Nephalem. Imperius frowned, but Malthael's single gesture cut him off, and they resumed their attack on Diablo. Despite her best efforts, the Nephalem was unable to tear the blade from Diablo's arm. Sching. Tyrael sword, blazing with holy light, sliced the tendons, severing the blade from the arm, causing her to stagger back. The Nephalem glanced up at Tyrell, who gave him a nod before taking off to help his fellows. As he swung his tail against Malthael and slashed his blade at him, Diablo managed to hurt him while slashing and weaving at them. He was pushed toward the edge of the crystal arch by Imperius and Oriel, who struck him with heavenly light. Tyrell dodged Diablo's attack and struck Eldruin squarely in the eyes once more. A gleam of satisfaction glinted in Malthael's eyes, though it was invisible. The archangels leapt away from the writhing prime evil with a single motion from Malthael. With a furious roar, Diablo spun around and prepared to strike them. In response, Oriel blinded him by directing a ball of celestial light straight into his face. With a roar of anger and pain, Diablo grabbed at his eyes and staggered backward until his feet were pressed up against the shattered remnants of the crystal arch's walls. Diablo's vision returned, and he snapped his eyes open and growled. The Nephalem, brandishing the blade that had been on his severed arm, was the last thing he saw before the agony tore through him. And the blade itself, tearing through his wounded chest's front. As the Nephalem kept driving the blade into Diablo's chest, a roar of agony reverberated throughout the terrace of the crystal arch as he staggered, his foot slipping off the edge, and his remaining arm sprang out, clinging to the wall's edge. She clenched the blade tightly, cutting into her hands as she pushed it through his damaged flesh and broke the barrier of the front of his rib cage, while the Nephalem gritted her teeth in agony. Diablo growled and struggled to stand up, and in spite of his injuries, he was getting better. When the Nephalem saw this, she had flashbacks of the atrocities she had witnessed that had led her to the life she was in at the time. She shouted, "Go to hell," and pressed the blade deeper into Diablo with one last push. The runes that adorned her body glowed brighter, and she felt a fierce fire burning in her eyes, tearing through his back, his organs, and his ribcage. RWOOARR, Diablo roared as the mental and physical agony of the wound overtook his body. Diablo let go of the shattered walls of the crystal arch and, along with the Nephalem, fell to his death with a loud scraping sound as his claws dragged across the fragments. Instead of letting go of the blade, the Nephalem attempted to drive it deeper, her wrath and fury overriding her logic as she worked to guarantee Diablo's death. She demanded restitution from the prime evil for the harm his hordes had caused to her, her family, and her village. So what if she had to die to accomplish that? For the first time, Diablo felt surprisingly mortal as he gazed up into the angry Nephilim's eyes. After his moment of great triumph, he was here, falling to his doom, brought down by a united front he had never thought of. Diablo suddenly started to feel aspects of himself disappear, so he focused on himself. As he collapsed, his legs and tail were turning to shattered ashes, quickly spreading to the rest of his body. Diablo was going to die, but this time, his death was different. Diablo had died numerous times before, so he was all too familiar with the feeling of death and how his soul would be pulled into the abyss to be born again. However, this pull was absent, and the sense of inevitable death was replaced by a sense of emptiness. This time, Diablo would not be reborn, he would never return. This time he was dying for real. This realization filled his eyes with horror, and he looked down at his chest, where the black soulstone was buried. With his teeth clenched, he realized that there was only one way to survive. He raised his other arm, and in a move faster than any blow he had ever delivered. After driving his clawed hand into his chest, Diablo encircled the black soulstone with his clawed fingers and started to squeeze. When the Nephalem realized what he had done, her own eyes grew wide, and the runes on her body and the light in her eyes faded. Gazing into the Nephilim's eyes, Diablo lifted his head and growled, "I will never die." In his chest, he crushed the black soulstone. As Diablo's body burned and the black soulstone exploded forth, sending hundreds of shards into the sky, the explosion triggered by this event threw the Nephalem back. Every shard was blazing with evil strength. As if the high heavens themselves disapproved of them, the shards blazed through the heavens like unholy comets before abruptly disappearing through what seemed to be tiny rifts. As she descended, the Nephalem gazed up at the sky, witnessing the fragments of the black soulstone, infused with Diablo's demonic power, disappear through rifts, their final destination unknown. No, she was so overcome with despair that her eyes were welling with tears. She saw the ground beneath her as she turned her gaze to the city below. Her pupils glistened. A sharp ache ripped through her chest. As blood spurted from her mouth and the widening wound in her chest, the Nephalem let out a painful gasp. As the remainder of the blood seeped from her wound, she coughed pathetically as she felt her lungs fill with it. She gazed at the instrument that had been her final demise as her head dropped as her strength left her. It was her own sword, sheathed hilt first in the ground, blade facing upward, torn through her chest, and smeared with her blood. She started to slowly close her eyes while coughing pitifully, one tear trickling down her cheek. It landed in the pool of her own blood beneath her as it fell from her face, creating ripples that reflected her features in the blood pool. Ultimately, her worst nightmare had materialized. She had passed away without leaving a single trace. When the archangels atop the crystal arch witnessed Diablo's last deed and the soulstones disappearing from the high heavens, infused with the strength of the burning hells, they gazed down upon the high heavens. Tyrael's voice expressed his horror as he fell to his knees, his armor gradually coming back to him as his wings grew again. No. Oriel, who was also gazing up at the high heavens, approached Tyrell slowly from behind and put a gentle hand on his shoulder. After clenching his fist, Imperius turned his back on the high heavens and strode out of the crystal arch toward the staircase. "The battle is ours. The war has only just begun," said Malthael as he took a step forward. Sanctuary. The sanctuary, which is situated between the high heavens and the burning hells, was originally intended to be a haven for angels and demons who were fed up with the great conflict of the struggle to determine who would rule all of creation. The Nephilim, the first race of man, originated on this realm. However, the realm of sanctuary was shielded from the high heavens and the burning hells by the schemes of the archangel Anarius, while the Nephilim weakened with every generation. Lilith, Anarius' demon lover, was not pleased with this since she had killed all the other demons and angels in the sanctuary in order to use the Nephilim as her own army. Sanctuary thus turned into a new front in the Great War. Beams of burning light fell from the sky, crashing into the ground below, and the skies above Sanctuary crackled with crimson lightning. One of these streams of light fell after the others, and as it fell, the light around it faded. A crimson, tinted black stone, no bigger than a child's pinky finger, was exposed, glimmering with an unholy light. As the rain fell, this stone fell to the ground, protruding from it, and a river started to glow upon it, shifting it from its original position and allowing it to flow downstream, its glow never going out. When the stone reached the base of a hill, it finally stopped flowing and floated in a tiny pool of murky water before gradually sinking. Before the hill's weakened soil abruptly broke free and tumbled down the hill, splashing into the puddle, its glow illuminated the pool of water as it sank beneath it, burying it with the stone. Skip in time while others carried a stretcher with a wounded man on top of it. A small group of cloaked individuals sliced through the underbrush in a large mountain forest. As their sword broke, one of the cloaked people swore, "Damn Senju! What do they grow trees of? Iron." They threw their broken sword to the ground and started making hand gestures. "Are you crazy? We are deep in Senju territory. Do you want to make it easier for them to find us?" a scathing figure asked, reaching out and squeezing their hands tightly. The man on the stretcher started coughing up blood and moaned in agony. After running up to the stretcher and placing a hand on the patient's forehead, one of the cloaked figures said, "Damn it all, he is getting worse." He turned to face the other three figures and said, "You three, set up a perimeter, we have to perform emergency treatment now." After giving a nod, the three figures darted into the trees. Suddenly, one of the figures arose on a tree branch and scanned the area for any indication of movement. They closed their eyes and made a hand signal when they couldn't find any. Through the tree line, a pulse reverberated from their body. With a sigh, they raised their heads, reached up to the hood, and quickly took it off. The figure was a pale person with matching eyes and onyx black hair. Although they had a soft face, they were unmistakably masculine in certain ways. They took a step forward and tumbled into the forest below from the branch they were standing on. They landed gently, glanced around, got to their feet, and started to move forward. "Senkusha." The figure heard a whisper and snapped their head to the left. They grasped the hilt of their sword, slung across their back, and glanced around, eyes darting back and forth. They quickly pulled it out and held it out, prepared to attack at any time. "Senkusha, Senkusha," the figure heard the whisper behind him and turned to look behind him. "Come to Maya, come to me, Senkusha." Senkusha moved forward reluctantly, his eyes appearing to go dim, as though a force were calling him, guiding him, making him feel like a passenger in his own body, existing inside it but having no control over it at all. Hacking through the vines, pushing past the undergrowth, he continued on without ever looking around. Two cloaked figures watched him from the trees above, intent on his every step. "Should we kill him?" asked the smaller of the two, turning their head and speaking in a clear feminine voice. The other figure appeared to be observing Senkusha's movements while staring down at him. He wasn't moving randomly, he wasn't looking for anything, instead, he was on his way. "Noah and Uchiha would not risk going so deep into our territory without a reason." He raised their hand and said in a deep, masculine voice, turning to face his comrade, "We shall follow, and see what was so important he would risk his life for it." After giving a nod, the woman turned back to face Senkusha. With unconscious eyes, Senkusha pushed past the low-hanging branches and vines. "Senkusha, come to Maya," said Mifria. In response to the call, Senkusha pushed past the low-lying branches and proceeded, stepping into a tiny dead area in the middle of the woods. There was nothing alive here, and the grass was dry and dead. Even tiny skeletons from various creatures of the wild were present. Additionally, there was a tiny, warped circle in the middle of the dead patch, where even the soil was dead. "Set me free." Even though his fingers were cut open by the sharp edges of the soil, Senkusha staggered forward, landed on his knees, and started dragging them through the dead soil, tearing up the sand and dirt. As Senkusha dug his hands into the dead patches soil, the two figures in the trees looked on in wonder and bewilderment. What might he have concealed here? Senkusha continued to dig until he abruptly jerked back, severing his finger with an unusually sharp object in the ground. Yesa. Senkusha gazed into the tiny hole he had created, then, gasping, reached inside, wrapped his fingers around what he had discovered, and continued to gaze. Glistening in the light with a dark and ominous aura, the black stone was no bigger than his son's pinky finger and tinted a deep crimson. Senkusha. Senkusha leapt to his feet and looked around. Damn it, Senkusha. What the hell are you doing all the way out here? We need to get back to the caravan now. He grabbed Senkusha by the arm and attempted to drag him as he saw another of his comrades running towards him, his face displaying obvious annoyance. Senkusha did not flinch. Senkusha, stop, Bay. The figure said, turning to face him, but he stopped in the middle of his sentence when he saw Senkusha's expression. Senkusha was staring, but not in the way he usually does. He could take that. Senkusha seemed to be staring at him and through him, but this look was different. Senkusha's gaze made him shudder. Eniki? Senkusha gripped his sword and the stone he was holding tightly while he gazed at his comrade, his younger brother. Killa. Senkusha fixed his gaze on his brother. Senku. His brother stared. Squelch. Senkusha's blade sliced through his chest, causing him to cough violently up blood that was rapidly filling his lungs. His eyes widened in horror and pain. He raised his head slowly and met Senkusha's eyes. The Sharingan eyes of Senkusha. His brother's life was extinguished when he coughed and attempted to reach out, gasping, Anakia, before his head collapsed. The two Senju watched in horror and astonishment as Senkusha quickly took the blade away from his brother in the trees. They then looked into his hand and saw the stone glow there. They picked that moment and jumped from the tree. Senkusha's eyes seemed to burn as he gazed down at the stone, his vision fading in and out, but he never once made a move that would indicate he was in pain. Uchiha. Senkusha slowly raised his head to see two Senju with their weapons drawn and staring down at him. The woman Senju said, "Whatever you have there must be pretty valuable. How about you hand it over and we will let you leave here with your life?" Senkusha's eyes were burning with utter rage as he gazed at the female Senju. The soiled Senju has the audacity to demand that he give up what was rightfully his. He growled, "Ida Isa mine. Well, guess we'll just have to pry it from Y. Aghh, snorted the female Senju. The female Senju screamed in pain as black flames suddenly covered her legs and quickly started to creep up her body, destroying her flesh. As she collapsed, the other Senju rushed to her and exclaimed, "No," he was going to attempt to extinguish the flames. Senkusha yelled, "I will not let you take it." Upon seeing this, the black flames exploded in front of the other Senju, and he jumped, which snagged his clothes' edges. Instantly, the other Senju's clothing was consumed by the black flames, and his cries of pain and agony, along with those of his female compatriot, reverberated throughout the clearing. Both of them were soon silenced, their bodies entirely reduced to ash. Senkusha's breath caught in his lungs as he gazed at them, his hand bleeding from the force he was exerting on the stone. "It is Minia," he stammered to himself as he panted. A pillar of smoke and ash swiftly formed as the black flames spread as he spoke, igniting the surrounding underbrush and moving to the higher branches. Senkusha ignored the flames, his eyes still hazy as he collapsed to his knees. The pain soon became too much to bear, and blood began to trickle from his eyes. He stared into the crimson-black stone in his palm as his vision slowly returned and he opened his eyes. Observing his image on the surface of the stone, he watched as the ring and the tomo distorted and changed together to form a three-pointed star, and his Sharingan eye twisted and warped. When Senkusha saw this, he lifted his head and grinned darkly and cruelly, saying, "It will all be mine." Time skip. Konoha's founding standing before a massive vault made of the strongest steel found in all the elemental nations. Hashirama Senju was surrounded by seals that had been created and incorporated by the best Fuinjutsu masters in the world. He let out a deep sigh as he gazed at the vault. He wished he didn't have to build the vault before him, but the events of the previous 3 months had given him little choice. The Uchiha clan had attacked Senju clan territory in full 2 months earlier. The Uchiha massacred the great majority of the Senju clan, including women, children, and men. They were furious with everyone. Hashirama and his brother Tobirama had arrived after the attack had started, and together they had successfully broken the back of the Uchiha forces. But soon after, the Uchiha clan launched their own counterattack, headed by Madara Uchiha, a Uchiha Hashirama was familiar with. Around them, Hashirama and Madara engaged in combat while their clans massacred one another. The two shinobi battled until their weapons fragmented, until they ran out of chakra, and until the last blow was delivered. At the end, Madara was lying at Hashirama's mercy, defeated. But rather than murdering Madara, Hashirama suggested a solution to the two clans' never-ending war, a means of at last coexisting peacefully. Even though Madara detested the Senju clan, he was coerced by the other members of his clan to accept Hashirama's proposal for a treaty on the Senju clan's terms. But when the conditions were laid out, they nearly started a new argument. In addition to numerous other clan treasures, the Uchiha clan was forced to give up a large portion of their wealth, jutsu, weapons, and even ancient tablets that had been passed down from father to son to mother to daughter for more generations than the Uchiha clan could recall. But they wanted peace more than they wanted to hold onto their possessions. Thus, the Uchiha clan gave up what they had with outraged acceptance. They found some solace in the fact that everything else was worthless in their possession and that the only treasures the Senju could utilize without Uchiha's assistance were the riches the Uchiha had amassed over the years. As restitution for the significant losses incurred by the Senju clan, their treasures were nevertheless seized. Additionally, a large vault was built to guarantee that the Uchiha could never use them and that no Uchiha could ever recover their lost treasures. Hashirama let out a deep sigh. He really didn't want to do this, but it was essential. All he could do was hope that the Uchiha clan would change over time and that they would be able to reclaim their treasures. He sighed deeply as he turned to face the samurai behind him, each of whom was carrying objects that had once belonged to the Uchiha. "All right, start loading up the vault," he said. The daimyo of Hai no Kuni, who had sold the Senju and Uchiha clans the land that would soon become the first hidden village, had dispatched the samurai as a neutral party. For the time being, it was essentially controlled by a joint meeting between the various clan leaders of the clans that had decided to join this new village. They served as a security force until the village had a stable government. It was a slow process, but after all, every great idea starts small. A samurai raised a big chest and handed it to another samurai who was waiting. With a heavy sigh, he wiped his forehead and went back to the pile to pick up something. A glimmer of light caught his eye out of the corner of his eye, and he looked to see what it was. There was an elaborate black box with golden handles off in the corner of the pile. The samurai approached the box out of curiosity and examined it. He had never seen anything like it before, and he couldn't recall seeing anything like this on the list of items to be placed in the vault. "Hey, I found something that I didn't see on the list. What should I do with it?" he said, turning to face a samurai who was chatting with Hashirama. "What is it?" the samurai and Hashirama asked, turning to face him. The samurai looked more closely and said, "Wait, I think I see a name on it." He shrugged his shoulders and said, "I'm not sure, it is some kind of black box with ornate drawings on it." "What is the name?" Hashirama asked, turning to face the samurai he had been speaking with. "Perhaps it was collected by accident?" he asked. Looking at the box, the samurai said, "It says a Senkusha Uchiha." With a quirked eye, the samurai asked Hashirama, "Senkusha? Is there a Senkusha Uchiha that you know of?" he asked. Trying to put a face to the name, Hashirama cast his gaze downward. Following the Uchiha and Senju treaty, all members of the Uchiha and Senju clans were required to be counted. Each man, woman, and child had to be identified, listed, and stored. He knew the faces and names of all the Uchiha clan members by heart. However, he was unable to identify Senkusha by face, saying, "No, but the name is very familiar, that I will admit." After rubbing their fingers together and running a finger over it, the samurai said, "Well, whoever they are, they didn't take very good care of their stuff. This box is covered in dust. I don't think it has been opened in a while." "Maybe it was just something they wanted to get rid of?" said the other samurai. With a sigh, Hashirama said, "Maybe. So, what should I do with this then?" the samurai asked, getting to his feet and pointing to the box. With another sigh, Hashirama gestured to the vault and said, "Just stick it in the vault with everything else." With a shrug, the samurai said, "Okay." He then grabbed the box's handles and entered the vault. Other samurai were piling up the vault's shelves with weapons, crates, scrolls, and anything else that had been taken from the Uchiha as reparations but that the Senju clan was unable to use. The samurai placed the box on the shelf, clapped his hands, and turned to leave after finally stopping in front of an empty shelf and glancing down at the box. "Well, looks like you will be collecting dust here." "Ichiroa? Huh, who said that?" the samurai asked, pausing in the middle of a turn. He noticed that the others had left the vault as he glanced around. He was by himself. "What the?" he said, scratching his head in bewilderment. "Ichiroa." He leapt and spun around where he heard the voice. As he gazed at the box, he couldn't help but cock his head in perplexity. He asked himself, what? Ichiro has set me free. Ichiro started to reach for the box, but he had no idea what was happening. Yes, Ichiro has set me free. Ichiro kept reaching for the box, his eyes glazed over. Ichiro. Ichiro. When the light returned to Ichiro's eyes, he turned his head to his side and noticed one of his allies staring at him anxiously. Ichiro, are you alright? He asked. Ichiro looked at him and said, yeah, I am fine. He then looked back at the box. Looking at the box Ichiro had been staring at, the samurai asked, are you sure? With a disbelieving expression. You seem to have been staring into space. Ichiro smirked back at his friend and said, hey, how about we go out for drinks? My treat. He rubbed his eyes and blinked a few times before saying, yeah, I am fine. Okay, who are you and what have you done with Ichiro? The samurai asked, staring at him. Ichiro gave the other samurai a backslap and laughed, saying, ah, cut it out, Kojira, we both know you cannot resist free drinks. After staring at him for a few seconds, the now named Kojira broke into a broad smile and said, huh, can't argue with you there. He then turned to leave the vault, saying, don't try and skip out on me again, Ichiro. Ichiro laughed and said, yeah, I know you old drunk you. He followed Kojira out of the vault, where they joked and laughed together. Before he let out a deep sigh and sealed the vault, Hashirama gave it one final look. He was unaware that his careless choice had doomed humanity as a whole. A century had gone by since the Senju and Uchiha clans' last battle, in which the Senju declared victory over the Uchiha. With the daimyo's approval, the village of Konohagakure no Sato was established within the country of Hai no Kuni as a result of that victory. Since then, they had not been the only ones to establish a shinobi village, and Konoha had been involved in numerous conflicts to guarantee its supremacy and ongoing existence. The nomadic clans that had been fighting for years to control one oasis after another had formed the village of Sanagakure no Sato, which was situated in the southwest deserts where the sands burned the skin of anyone who stepped on their surface. They banded together as a means of survival, and soon after, these clans, tribes, and small nomadic families built a massive wall to shield their citizens from the flaming sands. Inside the wall's boundaries, tall mud and brick buildings transformed the once small tribal community into a thriving village. Another village, known as Iwagakure no Sato, was built northwest of Hai no Kuni, tucked away by the Rocky Mountain ranges. Carved out of the rocky terrain by nomadic tribes that had gathered together when resources became limited and their own populations started to decline. The only way they could survive the harsh terrain at the time was to form an alliance. Due to this alliance, the village attracted many merchants and other nomadic tribes, and within a few months, the population grew significantly. They were also able to raise a family of more than one child for the first time. On the northeastern side of the peninsula, a village had been left by warrior clans, and the village of Kumogakure no Sato had grown from the highest peaks in the middle of the peninsula. The entire peninsula was a survival situation where only the most resilient and astute fighters survived. The country where they settled had few areas where farms or small villages could grow. Because warrior clans frequently destroyed their farms and homes during night raids in an attempt to preserve their own, farmers and settlers had little chance of surviving. But eventually, tired of the never-ending conflict, the warrior tribes moved to the middle of the peninsula, scaled the tall peaks, and discovered the harvest bounty hidden in the clouds. The blood and carnage that soaked the remote islands had been used to create a village on the largest of the many islands that faced the seas in the east. Each island had resources and other items that the other islands required, and despite their proximity, they were still divided by a vast ocean. The tribes that dotted the islands fought among themselves to take the resources they needed by force because they were isolated and had to survive. Clans perished and miraculously resurrected 100 times before the resources they had fiercely fought for eventually dried up and disappeared. But on one island, which was even more remote from the others but closer to the mainland than the others, the tribes had been able to obtain food and tools without resorting to violence. As a result, they extended a welcoming arm to the neighboring islands, providing food and tools that enabled the formerly isolated tribes to cultivate their own resources and use the ones they still had in a much more careful manner. This led to the gathering and consummation of what would become known as Kirigakure no Sato among the formerly homicidal warrior tribes of these islands. The earliest and possibly most powerful of the newly formed villages were these four in Konohagakure. Over time, these 5 villages earned the moniker, the 5 Great Hidden Villages. In between the 5 Great Hidden Villages, which were enormous towering structures, smaller but no less formidable villages were born. A farming community developed in the tall grasses east of Hai no Kuni, and eventually, in order to fight off bandits and the sporadic roving shinobi, They converted their tools from being used to cultivate life into weapons that were only used to destroy it. A nomadic tribe settled under a large tree in the towering forests to the northwest, in an area of the forests that is still unknown today. From this, the village of Kusagakure no Sato was founded. In those forests, the nomadic tribe discovered something that turned them into a lethal force. It was from this still secret place that Takigakure no Sato was created. Trade was made possible by the development and establishment of the villages, which allowed a prosperous and healthy populace to thrive and expand in comparatively safe conditions. Prior to the formation of the villages, most children were born to people who were still children themselves. Adults were lucky to live to 20, and children were lucky to have a childhood. The clan war era came to an end with the establishment of the hidden villages. And the era of the shinobi had begun. Conflict would inevitably recur, but this time it would be on a much larger scale than ever before, with entire nations of warriors fighting against one another. This was because the founders of the villages had been warrior clans and warrior tribes, and they were born from conflict. There was a continuous arms race going on, with each country attempting to stay one step ahead of its adversaries, and the villages were in a state of silent war even when there was no fighting. Konohagakure itself stood at the center of all of this, at a continual intersection of all these warring nations. As a result, they had the biggest advantage but were also at a severe disadvantage. They were constantly in danger of being invaded on several fronts because they had enemies on all sides. At the same time, their enemies had to enter Hai no Kuni, Konohagakure's territory, which they knew better than their adversaries, giving them a significant advantage over the invading forces. They were able to lead their adversaries into ambushes and choke points where they were primed for slaughter because they were familiar with the terrain and knew which way was which. Konohagakure had not only survived but also won all three of the Shinobi World Wars. As a result, they rose to become the strongest and most formidable of the 5 great hidden villages. In a time of perpetual tension, this fact had given them power and prestige, as well as a sense of peace. But it's a well-known fact that even the most formidable predator will succumb to a more formidable adversary. On October 10th, when the sun was setting and it was getting close to dusk, Konohagakure learned this lesson well, before they could even defend themselves. Their village was reduced to a heap of ash by the Kyuubi no Yoko. The Kyuubi attack occurred 15 minutes after Konohagakure, Merchant District. A young man with black hair and azure eyes moaned as he removed a fallen beam from a child who screamed in agony. The child's leg was broken by the falling beam, and they would not be able to walk on their own. The young man moaned, "Damn it, Hitomi, help me," as the beam started to sever his hands. A woman with a heart-shaped face and a generous build turned her head to face the young man as she yelled commands to civilians attempting to flee the burning district. She leapt from her perch and ran to him, her long brown hair swishing. She ran back towards the crowd after grabbing the child from beneath the beam. She shoved the child into the hands of an older man, who quickly took the child and began running with the rest of the crowd towards the bunkers. "How many so far?" the blue-eyed man asked, lowering the beam and panting heavily as he glanced at Hitomi. After glancing at the man with the blue eyes, Hitomi said, "About 57 Shigeko." "Kusoa, now what?" The now-named Shigeko muttered a curse. "Save as many as we can," Hitomi said, scowling as she addressed the burning merchant district. Despite smashing his foot against the floor and clenching his fists, Shigeko nodded his head and said, "Hi, Taiko." "Shinobi-san," the two said as they turned to go into the district. When both of them looked back, they saw the man who had been given the child running toward them with the child still in his arms. "What happened? You were supposed to head to the bunk," Hitomi said, her eyes widening a little. "We can't, a building collapsed, in front of USAI. Ida. The man interrupted, his voice trailing off as he started to choke. Stepping forward, Shigeko exclaimed, "What happened?" with a slight shout. "It fell on top of the crowd. I don't know if anyone got past Ida," the man stumbled out. "Noah." Hitomi's eyes widened at this point, and she turned to face the location where she had instructed the group to go. "Noah, no, Ayame," she thought as she started to run to locate the fallen building, but Shigeko stopped her, saying, "Let me go, my baby." "Hitomi, calm down," Shigeko grunted as he attempted to hold her. Turning and grabbing him, Hitomi growled, saying, "Don't you dare tell me to calm down, my daughter." Was at the very front of the group with your husband. He was probably past the building by the time it fell. You need to calm down now. When Shigeko was done, Hitomi stopped flailing. Sighed. "Look, you were worried, I know, but despite Tucci being a damn ramen chef, he can take care of himself, and Ayame. Right now, we need to save as many people as possible. We can't do our job if you start freaking out," so you need to calm down. Ayame will be fine. You got it? He spoke with an air of authority. Do you got it? He said louder, grabbing her shoulder when Hitomi didn't respond. Hitomi nodded, but it was clear that she was upset because she sniffed and looked up, saying, I got it. Shigeko nodded and said, Good, before turning to face the man with the still whimpering child. Did anyone else survive? He asked. Yes, about a s. 6 or 7 others I think. The man said, nodding, but clearly exerting himself. Damna. Shigeko swore once more before turning to face Hitomi and asking, Taiko, is there any other way to the bunker, besides the route they all went on? Hitomi looked around and said, Why? Yesa, and pointed down an alleyway. We can cut through the alleys and make it to the main road. The area should still be clear. But it will be a longer route, she said, jerking her head up and nodding slowly. Shigeko turned to face the man with the child and said, You, get the others and gather them here quickly. We will guide you to the road, now go, after nodding his head in agreement. Shigeko removed the child from the man's arms as he returned to retrieve the others after the man nodded. The man skidded to a stop in front of the few survivors of the falling building after running back to them. He looked over them and counted 7 people in total. 2 children, a boy and a girl, 4 adults, and a teenager. What happened, Isamu? The young girl asked as she held on to an elderly man who staggered forward. There is another way to the bunker. We need to go, now, stumbled the man, who was now identified as Isamu. After giving a nod, the older man leaned down to pick up the young girl, who cuddled up to him. Lead the way, Isamu. Isamu turned, nodded, and took a step forward. RWOAARR. However, the Kyuubi let out a terrible roar, causing the ground beneath them to tremble. The sheer force of the roar caused a shockwave. Nearby buildings that were already damaged started to creak, and a few more started to collapse. One of them was falling in their direction. With wide eyes, Isamu yelled, Move, and sprinted as quickly as he could to avoid the building's path. As the building collapsed on the scene, the other civilians followed suit. Isamu had toppled over, sprawling backwards farther than he had intended due to the force of the collision. He rose slowly and faced the survivors. Odo. Sama. When Isamu turned, he saw the little girl, covered in blood, crying and pulling on her father's arm as she attempted to rescue him from beneath the debris. The young girl clutched her father's arm and whimpered. In a desperate attempt to save his daughter, the father could not move quickly enough as the building collapsed, so he threw her as far as he could. She slid on the ground, severing her arms and legs, while her father was crushed by the falling house and was still coughing up blood as he drew his last breaths. Oh Odo. Sama, P. Pleasia, why you have to get Upa? The young girl whimpered, her face streaming with tears as her bloody hands attempted to drag her father from the debris. Isamu was treated to this sight as he approached the young girl slowly. His head hung low as he looked around, realizing that no one else had managed to escape the collapsing building and that this young girl would now likely be left an orphan. Why? Yoshiko. Chana, the father said, coughing, and slowly raising his free hand to his daughter's face. Odo. S. Sama, the now named Yoshiko sniffed as she took her father's hand. Even as he coughed, blood trickling down his cheek, the father grinned softly and said, My Yoshiko Achana. As he gasped for breath and slowly turned to face Isamu. He nodded his head, gesturing for Isamu to approach. Isamu moved forward slowly and dropped to his knees. Isamu ati. Take my daughter Ake. Keep her Safia. The father stumbled, trying to speak with what little life he had left. Isamu pressed his lips together, attempting to maintain his cool, and nodded his head slowly, saying, I will Kohei I willa. Why Yoshiko Masumiya? Yoshiko's father, Kuhei, grinned softly and said, Gee. Gooda, before carefully turning his head back to face Yoshiko, who was crying uncontrollably as she just kneeled there. Hi Odo. Sama, Yoshiko said, barely raising her voice above a whisper, as she sniffed and turned to face her father. Iel. Lova, Kuhei said slowly as he lifted his hand and moved his lips. As the final breath of life left his broken body, his hand went limp and his head followed suit, and no more words came out of his mouth. When Yoshiko whimpered, Oh, Odo. Sama, she got no response, so she reached forward and grabbed his arm, saying, Odo. Sama W. Wake Upa, and shaking it. Yoshiko Iya. Isamu said, lowering his head even more as he stood. Yoshiko ignored this and shook Kohei's arm more forcefully, saying, Odo. Sama P. Pleasia W. Wake up Pleasia. as her tears started to pour down her cheeks and she bit her lip. With a serious expression on his face, Isamu carefully took Yoshiko by the arms and dragged her away from Kohei's body. Yoshiko let out a louder whimper and gripped her father's long sleeve tightly. "Oto. Sama. Please wake up," she cried, tearing his shirt as she was yanked away. With tears in his eyes, Isamu clenched his jaw and tugged on Yoshiko once more. As Isamu carried her away from the scene, the outcome was a portion of her father's sleeve tearing off. "No, Oto. Sama, we can't leave Oto. Sama," Yoshiko cried and screamed, reaching for him with her other hand while unconsciously tightening her hold on the sleeve. As she moved farther and farther away from her father's body, all she could do was observe. She started screaming, "Oto. Sama, Oto. Sama," louder and louder. "Oto. Sama." With Shigeko and Hitomi. Shigeko was not in much better shape, and Hitomi was pacing back and forth while they waited for the group of civilians. But when they heard sobbing coming from the alleyways, they both stopped what they were doing, and Isamu approached them with Yoshiko and the still crying person. "What happened? Where are the others?" asked Hitomi as she approached him. Looking down, Isamu said, They didn't make it." Shigeko swore under his breath as Hitomi bit her lip and turned away. "2. Sama." The two shinobi turned to face Yoshiko, who was still in tears and holding on to her father's ripped sleeve as if it were her only hope. With a heavy sigh, Isamu held her close and tried to comfort her by sniffing, "Your Oto. Sama is Ina Aab. Better Placia." And swallowing, "Shish, it's alright Ayora," as he started to choke. The child with the broken leg was still in Shigeko's arms as he lowered his head, sighed, and said, "Come on, we have to get to the bunkers now." With a nod, Isamu trailed behind Shigeko, with Hitomi trailing behind. As more shockwaves hit the village, they dove through the alleys, had to jump over the debris, or had to find other routes because pieces of the roof fell in their path. At last, 2 shinobi, a civilian adult, and 2 injured children rushed out of the alleys and onto the main road. As they could now see the bunkers from where they were, Hitomi exhaled with relief. Thanked Kami. "Sama," she said, looking at the others, "come on, we are almost there." She moved forward, followed by the few survivors. Somehow, none of them fell on top of the small and battered group, even though they were blown back by sheer force, shattering the ground around them and bringing down numerous buildings. Shigeko moaned as he sat up, the child in his arms whimpering in agony due to their fractured ribs and even more broken leg. Yoshiko was barely able to stand after falling and being separated from Isamu, but she whimpered and sobbed. Hitomi had taken the brunt of the shockwave after falling the farthest away. With a groan, Shigeko glanced up at the location of the bunker. His eyes widened in horror, however, when he noticed a huge orange furred limb obstructing both the main road and his line of sight. Hitomi, Isamu, and Yoshiko were not the only ones who noticed this. They all looked up and their eyes widened in fear as they saw the face of the giant known as the Kyuubi no Yoko, its crimson-red slitted eyes staring into their very souls. Slowly opening their eyes, the child in Shigeko's arms saw the final thing they would ever see. The Kyuubi no Yoko's yawning maw, which sank into the ground around them. Tower of Kage Minato Namikaze, the Kiroi Senko of Konoha, the Yondaime Hokage of Konohagakure no Sato, and the hero of the Third Shinobi World War, was frantically going through every last scroll he could find in the cage vault in the cage tower. In the hopes of discovering something that could counter the Kyuubi no Yoko, he had torn through every last sealing and jutsu scroll, as well as genjutsu and taijutsu scrolls. Looking out the window, he saw the Kyuubi slam its jaws into the main road as he picked up another stack of scrolls and dragged them to his desk. His heart constricted in his chest as he prayed that the victims of the Kyuubi, whoever they were, perished swiftly and without suffering. He knew in his heart that it was too much to ask, though. Minato cursed as he read every single scroll. Because of his exceptionally fast reading speed and eidetic memory, he was able to quickly scan each one and extract all the information he could. Minato's heart sank deeper into his chest during the time it took him to read the scroll because he discovered nothing. Even after he had looked at the damn thing twice, nothing in the entire forbidden scroll of Sealsa, not a single Yoko, Seal, or Jutsua could aid him in defeating the Kyuubi. When Minato heard his wife's agonized screams during her delivery in the special hospital room reserved for the cage and their family, his head jerked to the ground. Her water broke during the evacuation, and the hospital was among the first targets of the Kyuubi attack. She had been inside since the beginning of the attack. She was giving birth to twins and had been hurriedly escorted to the cage tower. With his teeth clenched and his fingers clenched into a fist, Minato yelled, "Rog!" and snatched the forbidden scroll and the surrounding piles, hurling them from his desk and slamming his fist into it. Crack! He punched so hard that the desk cracked, breaking his hand in the process. Cursing while clutching his broken hand, he turned to face the randomly scattered scrolls scattered everywhere. And he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. He threw the forbidden scroll at the paper, which ought to have torn it given the force with which he threw it, but it didn't. He walked slowly away from his desk, glanced down at the scroll, and then took a quick look at what he had barely noticed. The scroll's edge has a seam. The single sheet of paper split in two as he reached forward and grabbed the scroll, running his hand along the seam. He opened the seam further, his eyes widening in shock, and was shocked to discover that the forbidden scroll of seals was even bigger than he had thought. He quickly carried the banned scroll to his desk and unrolled the seam to reveal the other half of the scroll. The design of the scroll caught his attention as he examined it. The seam was easy to open, but it was positioned so that even if one had the forbidden scroll in their possession, they could not find it by merely rubbing their finger against it. It was really miraculous that Minato threw the scroll aside and exposed the hidden part of the parchment. Minato's eyes widened as he moved away from the scroll, focusing on the text itself to see if there was anything there that could assist him. These jutsu were concealed for a reason. The Shinobi village system uses a ranking system for jutsu, with E rank being the lowest. These techniques included Bunshin and Kawarimi. Then came D rank techniques, which were more dangerous than E ranks but hardly a threat to experienced shinobi or even rookies like Megan. Narakumi no Jutsu. These techniques were not particularly dangerous by themselves, but when combined with other techniques or even slightly modified, they could turn the tide against inexperienced or lower ranked forces. C. Ranks, like Kaiten, Gokakyu no Jutsu, were higher up the ladder. They were lethal in the right hands and crippling in the wrong. B-rank techniques like Megan, Jubaku Satsu were above them, and A-rank techniques like Minato's own Rasengan technique or Kakashi Hitaki's Chidori were even higher. Above all, though, were methods that were considered illegal. These methods, like the Edo Tensai, were prohibited for a variety of reasons, including the fact that they were thought to be cruel or that they were a sign of evil. However, Minato could see that there were techniques even higher than S rank as he examined the hidden portion of the Forbidden Scroll, and he was also looking at a huge collection of them. As he read some of the techniques, bile rose in his throat. He knew in his heart that he should never have witnessed these methods, but what other option did he have? He searched the scroll, swallowing the bile in his throat, hoping to find something that would help him change the situation to his advantage. He nearly gave up after looking through more than half a dozen jutsu, each more heinous and vicious than the last, but he persisted after discovering a specific set of inscriptions in the Forbidden Scroll that described a seal, a strong seal, one of which had been created for a single purpose: to defeat a Biju. Hope surged in Minato's heart at this realization, and as he read the instructions on how to perform the seal, he grasped the edges of the scroll and brought it closer to his face. Bunri no Tamashi to Hanshitsu, which was created to seal a Biju, is referred to as a pseudo Jinchuriki. Chakra stores higher than a rank are needed for this sealing technique, along with 2 newborn vessels to hold the Biju. The Biju's soul and Yuki are severed by this seal, which then seals the 2 components into 2 vessels. The vessels cannot be older than a week because a Biju's Yuki is too toxic for anyone older than that to survive. Similarly, if the vessels are even a single second too old, the Biju's Yuki will be released as the Yuki burns through their coils. The Biju's soul will be released, sometimes killing the child, and will start to wander before eventually regaining its lost strength. It will not be able to merge with another soul that has claimed its place within the body. After finishing his reading, Minato bowed his head in a state of grief and self-loathing, questioning whether fate existed and, if so, whether it was treating him cruelly. According to Minato's understanding of pseudo Jinchuriki, a child who was given a Biju's Yuki would, in theory, have complete control over the Yuki because of the separation between the Yuki and the Biju's soul. The requirements of the seal, however, drove Minato to despair. The vessels could not be older than a week, and according to Konohagakure protocol, children and their mothers had to stay in the hospital for a month in order to make sure the mother and child were healthy, with very few exceptions. Additionally, the hospital was one of the first things destroyed during the Kyuubi's rampage. In order to use the jutsu effectively, he needed chakra stores that were higher than a rank, and Minato's chakra stores were only a rank. As Minato realized that using his own newborn children would be the only way to stop the Kyuubi, and that doing so would probably result in his death, his eyes filled with tears. What other option did he have, though? In order to deliver the news of his obligation, he left the office with a heavy heart and made his way down the stairs to his wife's hospital room. Kushina was breathing heavily while lying in the hospital bed, grinning subtly at the two bundles in her arm. She gave birth to twins, a girl and a boy, after several excruciating hours of labor. With a smile on her face, the medic. Nin, who was keeping watch, said, "Congratulations, Kushina. Sama, you're a mother." As her babies whimpered a little in their sleep, attempting to get closer to their mother, Kushina ignored the medic. Nin and embraced them. Another medic. Nin was nearby filling out some paperwork when they turned to face Kushina and asked, "Kushina. Sama, what will you name the children?" "My son will be named Naruto," Kushina said, looking down at each child. She then turned to face the young girl and said, "And my daughter will be named Natsumi." As they started writing out the birth certificates, the medic. Nin grinned and said, "Beautiful names." Kushina looked down at both of her kids and grinned, agreeing with the medic. Nin. Natsumi started to whimper in her arm as she reached out to Naruto with it. With a gentle smile, Kushina asked, "Ah, does Natsumi want to be with her Aniki?" She repositioned her grip on the kids so that they were both lying together but still in her arms. In response, Natsumi curled up against Naruto, who held her tenderly in his tiny arms. At the sight, the nearby medic. Nin cooed and snapped a few photos. As Minato entered the private hospital room, he saw this scene, which further crushed his heart. "Minato. Kuna Luka," Kushina said softly, gesturing to the infants, who were still cuddled up to each other, as she looked up and grinned at Minato. "They're beautiful, Kushina," Minato said, forcing a smile while biting his lip. "What is it, Minato?" Kushina asked, noticing the stammer in Minato's voice. With a small swallow, Minato turned to face the two medic. Nin present and said, "Leave us." "But, Yondaime. Sama, the two said, staring at the Yondaime in bewilderment. "Leave us." When their leader suddenly yelled, the two medic. Nin leapt back. After a moment of calm, they both left the room, leaving Minato and Kushina by themselves with the infants. Kushina scowled and asked, "Minato, what's going on?" Her husband was not prone to yelling or losing his temper, so she was concerned about his sudden actions. With his head down, Minato said, "The Kyuubi." With her body still extremely sore from giving birth, Kushina's eyes widened slightly. She had completely forgotten about the Kyuubi because of the pain of giving birth. "What happened?" she said, wincing in pain. As he moved forward slowly, Minato said, I found a way to stop it." "That's wonderful news," Kushina said, her eyes brightening and a smile spreading across her face. With one tear running from his eye, Minato bowed his head once more. A frown replaced Kushina's smile. Minato sniffed and said, "To stop the Kyuubi, I have to seal it into living vesselsa." Before slowly raising his head and choking on his words. "To a younger living vesselsa," he said. "Minato, what area you?" Kushina stared at him, her eyes widening as she realized what Minato was saying. She then looked down at her babies, still in her arms, and said, No, absolutely not." She brought her babies closer to her, protecting them with her arms, and said, "I won't let you turn our babies into Jinchuriki. I won't." While choking, Minato said, "Kushina, listen, No, you listen. I will not, ever, under any circumstances allow my babies to be used to hold a demon. Do you understand me?" Bringing his hands up and extending several fingers, he exclaimed, "Damn it, Kushina, what choice do we have? I couldn't find any other way. No ninjutsu, no genjutsu, no taijutsu, no spell even, that could stop the Biju. Damn it, Kushina. Do you think I want this?" Kushina held her children close to her in defiance without saying anything. Minato took a deep breath and looked down. "Kushina, if I don't do this, our children will not see the sunrise. We can't evacuate, otherwise I would have done that already. Kushina. I am out of options." Despite her and Minato's yelling, Kushina glanced down at her infants who had dozed off. With a heavy sigh, she moved her hand and gingerly stroked their heads. "Oh. Okay. She stammered as tears started to well up and fall down her cheeks. "Kushina?" Minato asked, looking up. "Okay. Kushina said with a heavy sigh, turned to face Minato, and slowly extended the children for Minato to accept. With a heavy sigh, Minato moved forward and grabbed for the two newborns, but he was frozen in place when Kushina herself gave him a strong, precise killing intent. With her eyes narrowed, Kushina said venomously, "They come back alive, unharmed, and unblemished, or it's your ass, Minato." As the intent to kill was revealed, Minato nodded his head slowly. He took Naruto and Natsumi from Kushina in slow motion, then turned around to leave the room while concealing the sad expression on his face. He was about to use a seal that would probably kill him, but he didn't have the guts to tell her. "The Konoha the once." bustling merchant district was reduced to a mountain of dust and ash as the Kyuubi no Yoko roared and slashed through the ground, attacking everything and anything with ruthless intent. For a few seconds, a shimmer of 3 Tomo dominated the Kyuubi's slitted eye as it roared to the sky and turned its head upward. At the same moment, Minato Namikaze, the twins' father and Yondaime Hokage of Konohagakure no Sato, leapt over the flaming buildings while clutching his kids close to his chest. His route led to Kyuubi no Yoko. Either unaware of or indifferent to the approaching Minato's presence, the Kyuubi slashed at the surrounding buildings and smashed its tails into the ground. Minato carefully placed his kids on a cool surface after skidding to a stop on the mountains of debris. After taking a deep breath, Minato smashed through multiple hand seals, exclaiming, "Kachiyose no Jutsu," and slamming his hand into the ground below. He and his kids then shot into the sky in a huge cloud of smoke, which abruptly cleared to reveal a huge toad smoking a pipe and carrying a huge sword on his back. "Minato, why have you summoned me?" the toad said, grunting and raising its eye. "RWOOAARR. The toad blinked and halted its sentence, saying, "Uma, never mind." Minato was gasping and panting. "Gamabunta. Sama, I need you to attack Kyuubi. Keep it in place long enough for me to do what needs to be done." "Okay, but after this is over, we need to have a little talk about what you can summon me for, and what you can't summon me for." Gamabunta snorted and turned to face Minato. "Fine, but after this is over, we need to have a little talk about what you can summon me for, and what you can't summon me for." He then reached for his blade, drew it out with swiftness that shouldn't have been possible for someone his size, and fired at the Kyuubi, Minato and the kids still safely on his head. Minato clenched his teeth and started to make the required hand signals with one hand. He then knelt down to where his kids were and started drawing the seals on their stomachs with a brush and ink. Gamabunta, meanwhile, slashed at the toad summon and Kyuubi, who merely prevented the giant blade from hurting it. Gamabunta leapt back, then lunged forward once more, slashing viciously as he hurled water globs at the enormous beast. When the water hit the biju, it merely produced steam against its body. As he completed the seals and all but the final hand sign of the technique, Minato gasped. After slowly getting to his feet, he took a handful of chakra, replenishing pills out of his pouch. He threw the handful of pills into his mouth in one motion, bit down, and quickly swallowed them. He then screamed in agony as the pills began to act immediately, filling his chakra coils with more chakra than he had ever had before. Gamabunta yelled, "Minato, do it now," after pushing the Kyuubi back and pinning him against Konoha's collapsed wall. "Pardon me," Minato said, grunting in agony as he looked down at his kids, one tear streaming from each eye, and then he did the last hand seal, Bunri no Tamashi to Hanshitsu. Minato's hands shot forward, his own chakra blazing out of him like a raging inferno, as he reached for the Kyuubi, and in that one moment, the children were illuminated with a burning blue light. Chakra sprang in the form of enormous arms that tore through the biju completely. The beast roared in pain and swung its head back. Feeling his chakra reserves being depleted by the second, Minato gritted his teeth and started tugging on the biju itself. The beast's shape started to change and fade, and it roared in agony. Minato let out a cry of pain and pulled one last time. The Kyuubi's body broke in 2 pieces in that moment, each of which, grasped by the chakra arms that extended from Minato, compressed into 2 spheres in a matter of seconds. As he continued the jutsu, Minato wheezed and coughed, dragging the 2 spheres back with him and forcing them into the seals he had applied to both of his children. The Yuki and Soul were sealed away in his children, and the seals glowed. Minato felt the strain on his koilsa, the emptiness in Tama, and gasped as he fell onto Gamabunta's head, his vision growing blurry. And as his eyes closed and his vision failed him, he saw a ghostly figure reaching out to him. Time. Skip the village had already started to rebuild 2 days after the Kyuubi were defeated. The damaged merchant district was being rebuilt by both civilians and shinobi. As it was, the shinobi would have to open the dry storage vaults and then try to use their jutsu to clean the burned soil surrounding Konoha so that crops could grow inside the village walls once more. While the new hospital was being constructed, this time much farther away from the walls, both doctors and medic.nin had turned old warehouses that had not been used since the war into a makeshift hospital. The damage caused by the Kyuubi attack, however, could not be forgotten despite the reconstruction efforts because the loss of life was incalculable. As they stood over an empty coffin, a daughter sobbed beside her father because the mother's body was nowhere to be found. The coffin containing his wife's broken body was stained by his tears as he kneeled over her grave. The only way they knew it was her brother was because of the bracelet that was burned into his arm. The sister had thrown herself onto her brother's coffin, who had been so severely damaged by the Kyuubi's vicious Yuki. As the deceased were buried, cremated, and their ashes dispersed to the winds. Tales like these were told throughout Konoha. The Kyuubi attack had not been a quiet incident, and word of it had spread like wildfire from the nearest towns of Hai no Kuni to the cage office of the Tsuchikage himself. Without a leader, however, the current death toll would only increase. And Konoha had no chance without a leader to lead them. As a result, Hiruzen Sarutobi, the former Sandaime Hokage, assumed the role of Hokage of Konohagakure no Sato once more. The Sandaime was currently seated at the Hokage desk, looking over the documents in front of him, the border patrol reports that Hai no Kuni had brought, and the suggestions that his former adversary Danzo Shimura had made. With a heavy sigh, Hiruzen reached for a short rod that had been sitting in an open flame and had an insignia on the end. He pressed the rod against the form in front of him while thinking only one thing. This shit is too old for me. He gave his approval for Tsuchi no Kuni's daimyo to be assassinated. Skip in time. Medic.nin was examining a number of charts in the Cage Tower hospital room while glancing at Minato Namikaze's prone form. He had lost consciousness after enclosing his children in the Kyuubi's Yuki and Soul. By all accounts, he should have died because the technique used so much chakra that it depleted his reserves to the very last. He was only still alive because Medic.nin arrived on time and because the chakra replenishing pills made his chakra network generate more chakra. But saving his life was not simple. Through a complicated and potentially fatal seal matrix, the Medic.nin performed forced chakra transplants, transforming their own chakra to match Minato's. This allowed his chakra circulatory system to maintain the functionality of his heart, lungs, liver, kidneys, and brain. For 2 days in a row, the Medic.nin stood by him while he lay in the middle of the seal matrix. They exhaled in relief when his body had stabilized and his chakra circulatory system started to generate enough chakra to maintain the functionality of his internal systems. But it was a hollow sigh. He had been put into a comatose state by the trauma his body had endured, and no matter how hard the current Medic.nin tried, they couldn't bring him out of the coma, not even Tsunade Senju, who had come back to the village after learning of the Kyuubi attack. Since then, Minato had been confined to the hospital room in the Cage Tower, hooked up to a machine that monitored his pulse, heart rate, brainwave activity, and other vital signs. He was also receiving intravenous nutrition and having a tube placed to remove his bladder. After a month, the Medic.nin shook their head and looked down at the Yondaime, not noticing any change. After taking note of the machine's readings, the medic approached Yondaime's bed and put a gentle hand on his shoulder, saying, "Wake up soon, Yondaime. Sama, we need you." This specific Medic.nin had done this numerous times every day, hour and minute in the hopes and prayers that their Yondaime would come out of his coma. And they got no response in return, just like they did every other time. They turned away from the Yondaime's bed, clenching their fingers lightly and closing their eyes as they made their way back to the medical camp set up just outside the Cage Tower to tend to the rest of the wounded. Beep. They heard a loud beep coming from the brainwave scanner, but they abruptly stopped and turned around. Beep, beep, beep. With wide eyes, the Medic.nin rushed to the Yondaime's bedside and examined him. A slight twitching of the eyelids, a heavier gasp coming out of the Yondaime's mouth, a slight tick here. All of these were minor, but this Medic.nin had been trained for many years by none other than Tsunade Senju, and they had observed these symptoms in numerous other comatose patient cases. With this knowledge, the Medic.nin reached a single conclusion. It was the Yondaime awakening. A grin appeared on their faces, and they sprinted back to the room's door, opened it, and yelled, "He's waking up! Yondaime! Sama is waking up!" into the hallway. The Medic.nin's eyes widened as a frown started to form as they turned their head back to the Yondaime. He was descending back into his coma as the slight twitches slowed and eventually stopped. "No, no, no, don't you go back, Yondaime. Sama, don't you go back." The Medic.nin swore as they ran back to the Yondaime's bedside. They then charged healing chakra into their hands and applied it to the Yondaime's left temple and forehead. The Yondaime was waking motionless, and his slight twitches returned. "Damn it, Minato! Wake up!" The Medic.nin yelled as she started to pour more of the healing chakra into Minato. The Medic.nin panted as they felt their chakra being drained rather quickly from the strain, and their black hair fell into her black eyes. When the medical room door slammed open, Hiruzen Sarutobi, 2 other Medic.nin, and a woman with a large bust, blonde hair, and a purple diamond on her forehead were all visible. "Wake up!" was the Medic.nin's cry as they concentrated all of their energy on rousing the Yondaime, but they either failed to notice or didn't care. The Yondaime's electric blue eyes opened, and he gasped for air as he leapt to his feet, panting heavily. "Shizune!" the blonde-haired woman said, looking at them worriedly as the medic.nin staggered backwards due to the force of him shooting up. Tsunade. Sama. The now named Shizune asked, looking up and gasping for air. Concerned, Tsunade asked, Shizune, are you alright? Shizune merely grinned and nodded, saying, why? Yeah. Just really tired. She then started to sag as her chakra's drain caught up with her. Holding her up, Tsunade said, whoa, Tharia, okay, you have worked long enough. Then, grunting, she lifted Shizune up bridal style and said, you are going to the camp to sleep. Tsunade then started to leave the hospital room, but not before grinning and briefly glancing between Shizune and Minato. Hiruzen Sarutobi approached the panting Yondaime as they were leaving, and he started to survey his surroundings. Hiruzen coughed, Minato, as he stood beside his bed. Hiruzen's eyes widened in surprise as Minato abruptly snapped his gaze to him. After a few minutes of silence, Minato pointed accusingly at Hiruzen and said, alright, what the hell did you do to get sent to hell? What? Hiruzen asked, his face hardened in an angry expression as he gazed at Minato. I am in a hospital, I hate hospitals, I died, so where else could I be besides hell? Minato said, gesturing to his surroundings. Minato, you didn't quailed Hiruzen. Minato sighed. Oh sure, I am sure somehow somebody got to me just before I dropped completely dead, and managed to save my life. With a blank expression on his face, Hiruzen said, yes, actually, they did. Frowning, Minato said, prove it. Smack! A slap came out of nowhere, knocking Minato off the bed completely and sending him tumbling over with enough force to crash into the wall as well. Minato was lifted off the ground with an extremely powerful tug before he could even mutter in agony. He was then punched in the nose with enough force to break it and bend some of his teeth slightly backwards. Minato's head slammed back, and he eventually moaned in agony before opening his eyes gradually. As she started shaking him, he noticed Kushina staring at him with fiercely burning eyes. What did I tell you, Minato? What the hell did I fucking tell you when you went to go stop the Kyuubi? He asked. Minato started to shake so violently that he felt the force of the shaking crack his neck. I told you that they were to return to me alive, unharmed, and unblemished. Kushina screamed louder, releasing chakra and killing intent that started to erode the ground beneath her. Kushina. Minato's eyes widened at those words. Kushina. Sama. When she snapped her head to see who had spoken, Kushina stopped smothering Minato and saw a nurse frowning at her while placing her hands on her hips. Kushina. Sama, it may have been a month, but you shouldn't strain yourself so much, you are still recovering. Finia. Kushina scowled, pushed Minato against the wall, and whirled around. With a grunt of pain, Minato started to slowly raise himself at this point. He looked up at Kushina and then at Hiruzen, saying, okay, I believe you. With a small growl, Hiruzen said, good, now, since you are Awakea, take it. He then threw the cage hat at him and said, don't ever put me in a position where I have to wear that accursed thing ever again. He then bounded down the halls and left the room. In the meantime, Kushina turned to face Minato and seized him by the shoulder, saying, come on, Minato. Where are we going? Minato yelled as she abruptly pulled him up and dragged him out the door. Without glancing at him, Kushina said, you'll see. After pulling him down the hallway, she opened a door, pushed Minato inside, and said, okay, now Minato, look at our children and tell me why I am upset with you. She crossed her arms. After glancing at Kushina, Minato slowly turned around, his eyes slightly widening. There was a queen-sized bed in the room, a crib against the wall, a door that led to what he thought was a bathroom, 2 more doors that led to 2 smaller rooms, and a closet close by. Minato gave the crib his full attention and started to approach it slowly. His breath caught when he peered into the crib and saw what a woe was inside. A young boy, no more than a month old, with blonde hair that slightly spiked up, and flawless skin that shone in the room's light, was lying next to a young girl of the same age who had a mix of blonde and red hair. However, as he looked at the girl, he realized what must have been the cause of Kushina's anger toward him. He could tell that the 3 whisker marks on each cheek were not drawn there because they appeared to be a natural part of her skin. He turned to Kushina after taking a small gulp and said, the whisker marks on our daughter. Yep. Kushina nodded. With a sigh, Minato glanced down at the 2 kids before turning back to Kushina and preparing to say, I accept whatever punishment you choose to give me, Kushina. While Minato remained in that state, Kushina merely approached the crib and carefully lifted the young girl, saying, the broken nose was your punishment, Minato. Minato's eyes popped open, and he slowly turned to face Kushina. Really? He asked. Yesa. Kushina said, grinning and holding the girl to her chest, but she jerked her head in his direction and said, "But only because I find them cute, got that, Minato?" Minato leapt back and quickly nodded his head. After grinning, Kushina turned back to face her daughter and said, "Good. Soa W. What is her name?" Minato remained where he was, staring at Kushina while holding their daughter. With a smile, Kushina turned to Minato and said, "Her name is Natsumi." Glancing over Kushina's shoulder, Minato grinned and blinked before saying, "Natsumi, it's a beautiful name, dear." Both Kushina and Minato cooed and tickled the yawning little girl as Kushina giggled and turned to face Natsumi, who started to yawn. He clenched his fingers on the edges of his blankets, a whimper escaping his 1-month-old lips, but neither of them noticed the little blonde as they concentrated all of their attention on the yawning girl with the whisker marks. The Yondaime Hokage of Konohagakure no Sato had risen from his month-long torpor less than 3 days earlier, but he insisted on going back to work right away in spite of Tsunade's own protests. This decision relieved the elderly Hiruzen, who gladly stepped aside as Minato took back control of the day-to-day operations of Konoha's recuperation. Minato had insisted on meeting with the village council as the first item on the agenda. Even though Hiruzen had given Minato important information about the village's recovery, he still preferred to hear the specifics from the people in charge of each project. Although many were delayed because of the abruptness of the mandate, the council, the leaders of the various clans, the civilian leadership that had been tasked with rebuilding the mercantile district, the orphanages, and the civilian housing were quick to respond to Minato's call for a conference. Minato himself was looking through a small pile of documents that described the investments and decisions that had been made during his month-long absence. He spent a few minutes looking through the files before turning his focus to the council, whose members had finally taken their seats in the council chambers following a number of delays. Following a brief call to order, Minato was seated in front of the council chambers, while the other officials were seated in their assigned sections. Minato then spoke in a clear and friendly tone, saying, "Thank you all for responding to this summons expediently." He then looked over everyone's tired but alert faces before continuing, saying, "I understand that during this trying time, you have all been pressed to the brink of what you were capable of, and yet even still, there is more work to be done." Many of the attendees gave a brief nod as he continued, "Rest assured, that this session shall be brief. I do not wish to impede your duties any further than I must." After giving the assembled officials one last glance, Minato grabbed the first file from the top of the stack and said, "I call to the stand, Danzo Shimura, to address the council and civilian officials in regards to the recent excursions with Iwagakure." The seated individuals looked at the stationary figure of an elderly man. Although his appearance suggested some weakness, his posture, even when seated, suggested otherwise. His left arm, right arm, and a large portion of his right torso and face were all bandaged as he turned to face the Yondaime, indicating that an injury had occurred that was too severe to be repaired through rehabilitation or surgery. Even though the elderly shinobi was hobbling toward the stand, he still carried himself with the proper demeanor when he was summoned to the platform. Danzo took a seat in front of the Yondaime and bowed his head to Minato. "Danzo Shimura, in your report, you verified that a contingency of Iwagakure forces, composed of Jonin, Chunin, as well as a unit of Genin, was reported to cross the border between Hai no Kuni and Kusa no Kuni, 3.5 weeks prior to today's assembly. Is this inaccurate?" Minato asked, nodding his head in turn, then opening the file before casting a critical glance at the Shimura sitting there. His tone elicited a quick response. Danzo looked towards the Yondaime's eyes unflinchingly, and uttered forth his response, "It is not inaccurate, Yondaime. Sama, no less than 25 days prior to this assembly, scouts along the border observed 6 Iwagakure Jonin in the northwestern forests of Hai no Kuni, a particular region, which is only a few days' journey from Kanabi Bridge. 2 of our seasoned scouts examined the area, and found the remaining contingency setting up a base of operations, a probable staging ground for a full-scale invasion, based on the construction of several shelters, all of which had been positioned within the vicinity to form a defensible perimeter, as well as the construction of a provisional pathway, which would allow for the expedient delivery of supplies, as well as the movement of a larger force within the area. Several other shelters were being constructed in the surrounding region, but this location in particular was no doubt the primary staging ground, while the outlying settlements would serve as positions for smaller detachments to bolster the defenses of the primary staging ground. After absorbing the veteran shinobi's report, Minato looked at Danzo calmly for a moment before turning to the file in front of him. There were no differences between Danzo's report and the file in front of him. Danzo continued, "The scouts later reconvened with their comrades, and reported their observations to their immediate commanding officer, who relayed this information back to Konoha, where it was reported to Sandaime Sama, and passed on to myself. I was ordered by the Sandaime to devise a response to this clear violation of the treaty that Iwagakure had signed after the conclusion of the Third War. What was the response you brought forth to the Sandaime? Minato asked, turning back to face Danzo. Danzo's response was direct. I advised Sandaime Sama to send a small contingency of our Black Ops Anbu to infiltrate the staging ground and remove the contingency in place by placing explosive tags on key structural points. The staging grounds and the surrounding camps could not have been set up more than a week prior, as the area had been clear fewer 8 days prior to the incident in question. With that in mind, and the amount of supplies they had at their disposal, in addition to the limited contingency in place, they would not have had time to enhance the structures to remove the less obvious weak points in facilities. Once the charges were in place, the Black Ops would be ordered to detonate the tags from a safe distance, when a sufficient population of the Iwagakure forces returned to the staging grounds from their routine patrols. This would eliminate the immediate forces, while simultaneously forcing the upper chain of command to readjust their plans to set up a new staging ground, giving us time to prepare, if they did not immediately call off their invasion entirely. Minato raised his eyebrows, a sound strategy. He read the report carefully. According to your report, the infiltration went off successfully, resulting in the death of a majority of the Iwagakure forces in the area, but also resulting in the death of 3 of our shinobi, who were not able to escape the area in time to avoid the explosive tag's blast. Danzo replied by nodding his head. That is correct, Yondaime Sama, an unfortunate loss, but one that is preferable to the losses we would have suffered had we not responded when we did. Were there any further incidents along the border? Minato asked, scowling softly as he looked at Danzo closely before turning back to the report on his desk. Danzo sighed. No, Yondaime Sama, though, this had less to do with us finding their base, as it had to do with internal conflicts in Tsuchi no Kuni. What do you mean? Minato asked, turning to face Danzo. Danzo opened up. As we were responding to the threat imposed by an invasion by Iwagakure, the daimyo of Tsuchi no Kuni was assassinated. All evidence in regards to his death pointed towards the Yondaime Tsuchikage, who was instated no less than a year ago. When the new Tsuchikage was mentioned, Minato clenched his teeth a little. One of the few foes Minato actually battled, the Yondaime Tsuchikage, was a formidable shinobi with whom Minato had previously fought on the battlefield. Additionally, he was obviously hostile toward Konoha, and even prior to his appointment as Yondaime Hokage, he had been advocating for a new war with Konoha, to which a large portion of Iwagakure was ready to react. But the power wielded by the daimyo of Tsuchi no Kuni over Iwagakure stopped him from doing so. The Tsuchikage threatened to punish Iwagakure for continuing his quest for another war with Konoha by threatening to cut off funding and blockade trade routes. Danzo continued, with the evidence before them. Despite his protests of innocence, the Yondaime Tsuchikage was arrested, tried, and charged with the murder of the daimyo. He was executed the day after his trial. He exhaled deeply. Our spies in Tsuchi no Kuni were able to gain access to the body before it was destroyed, confirming that it was in fact the Yondaime Tsuchikage that was executed, and not a fraud, dying in his place. We can confirm with certainty that the Yondaime Tsuchikage is dead, and the Sandaime Tsuchikage has replaced him. Iwagakure was forced to call off their planned invasion, and consolidate their forces within Iwagakure and the surrounding territories, especially with many of their supply lines now being placed under the jurisdiction of the new daimyo. Minato looked at Danzo, nodded his head in agreement, and then turned to face Hiruzen, who was sitting next to him. They exchanged a knowing glance. By portraying Iwagakure as treacherous and unreliable, the official narrative gave Konoha the time it needed to reassemble its own army and recover from the Kyuubi's attack. But if the real story were ever made public, it would undoubtedly lead to another conflict. The Yondaime Tsuchikage had been implicated in the assassination of the daimyo of Tsuchi no Kuni, but Konoha shinobi had planted the evidence at Danzo's direction. The Sandaime knew that even if they removed the staging grounds in the northwest, the Tsuchikage would simply change tactics if they did not act quickly to put Iwagakure in a compromising position when the reports of an Iwagakure force entering Hai no Kuni reached his desk. Danzo fortunately had a solution that would put Iwagakure in a position where they would be powerless to harm Konoha. As a result of the Yondaime Tsuchikage's repeated arguments with the daimyo of Tsuchi no Kuni, who was actually opposed to another war, the Yondaime had not followed the correct procedures to establish a staging area for an invasion of Hai no Kuni. When the body of the daimyo was discovered dead, they were put in a position where they had no sympathy or support for their claims of innocence because of the proper evidence and the disclosure of Iwagakure's plans to invade Konoha. This was especially true when the evidence implicated a rival of his that was well known. With several of their supply lines now under the new daimyo's control, Iwagakure was forced to invest significant resources in ensuring the livelihood of their population, which prevented them from forming any plans against Konoha. The general public, however, would see the deception and believe it to be real. The actual events of the past month would be kept hidden and never seen again because Konoha would be destroyed by the consequences of revealing such information. Before nodding his head in affirmation, Minato glanced at the file on his desk and said, "Thank you. You may return to your station, Shimura-san." Danzo acknowledged Minato's order with a nod of his head, got up from his chair, and took his place again, maintaining his honorable stance even as he strained to get comfortable in it. After a moment of staring at the seasoned shinobi, Minato closed the file in front of him and moved it to his right before reaching for the next file on the stack and saying, "I call to the stand, Hisashi Hyuga, to address the council and civilian officials in regards to the recent reports of dissent in Kumogakure towards the leadership of the Sandaime Raikage." The current councilors and civilian officials' eyes shifted to the figure of Hisashi Hyuga, who was seated with his twin brother and the head of the Hyuga clan. Since the two were identical in every way, the only way to tell them apart was by the bandages that Hisashi Hyuga had wrapped around his forehead, something the Hyuga clan head never had. As instructed, the aforementioned Hyuga got up from his chair and fast, stiff-backed, he walked slowly to the front of the council chambers and took his place, just as Danzo Shimura had just occupied it. Hisashi Hyuga, in your report, you established, with indisputable evidence, that within the hidden village of Kumogakure no Sato, rising dissent against the Sandaime Raikage's militaristic approach has been gaining consistent traction as of late, with reports of open rebellion suggesting what could be the start of a civil conflict within Rai no Kuni, 2 weeks prior to today's assembly. Is this inaccurate? Minato asked, looking at the seated Hyuga, before he flipped open the front of the file and fixed his piercing gaze on the shinobi in front of him. Hisashi Hyuga replied quickly, "It is not, Yondaime. Sama, no less than 14 days ago, our spies within Rai no Kuni, and centers bordering Kumogakure itself, reported that within the hidden village of Kumogakure, dissent and uprisings have become far more numerous as of late. The Sandaime Raikage's call for war, so soon after the tremendous losses they received in the previous conflict with Konoha, Suna, and Kusa, have resulted in him losing a great deal of support from the clans and civilian merchant guilds which supply Kumogakure with 1/3 of its revenue. In response, the merchant guilds have suspended all trade with Kumogakure, resulting in the Sandaime being forced to reduce payment for official missions in order to ensure day-to-day management of the village, which includes water collection, food production, as well as medical care for shinobi returning from missions. The shinobi populace is not fond of the loss of promised payment for missions, I presume?" Minato said, cocking his head. Hisashi nodded. "While your presumption is not untrue, this is not the heart of the issue itself. Kumogakure suffered greater casualties in the previous war than Suna, Iwa, and Konoha combined. The loss to their forces, population, and families has caused many of the active shinobi to become weary, and the Sandaime Raikage's attempt to return to a time of conflict, so soon after the last one, has left much of its forces outraged, and calls for the Sandaime to step down and have a new Raikage supplant his position, has gained greater prominence as of late." Minato scowled as Hisashi's report nearly exactly matched the file in front of him. In fact, Kumogakure had suffered greatly during the last conflict. Even though their location in the mountains made it impossible to invade their territory, this did not help them when they launched full-scale invasions of the neighboring areas. Their troops were trained to defend and counter from the mountainous areas from which they had sheltered since the establishment of their villages, even though they were proficient in combat. Their forces encountered a bloodbath unlike anything they had ever seen in the open fields, low-lying areas, and forests encircling their mountainous region. From its past battles with Kumogakure, Konoha had learned a lot and had created effective defenses against the strategies they so frequently use. Consequently, Kumogakure had gone through a hostile campaign before their numerical advantage over Konoha and the surrounding areas was lost due to a shortage of manpower, and they were compelled to return to their mountainous havens. The Sandaime Raikage, a proud and aggressive man, had not liked this. Instead, he had to watch his forces suffer a devastating defeat and return home broken and defeated. He had hoped that his numerical advantage would be sufficient to push back against Konoha and allow them to establish footholds within Hai no Kuni, gain new resources, new land, and increase the wealth of his village. His demands for a new war so soon after such a terrible defeat would have undoubtedly infuriated the public. It would not be long before he was replaced, but the Yondaime and current councilors were still unsure if his replacement posed a bigger or smaller threat than he did. Minato raised his eyebrows at Hisashi. "Continue monitoring the situation in Rai no Kuni. Any information pertaining to the uprisings or even potential uprisings is to be reported directly to me. Is that understood, Hisashi?" While scowling, Hisashi bowed his head in agreement, saying, "Yes, Yondaime. Sama, it will be done. When Minato closed the file in front of him, his eyes lingered and he said, "You may return to your seat, Hizashi." Hizashi put his hands on his thighs, then slowly stood up again, then turned, his posture as stiff as before, and went back to his seat next to his brother, who gave him a questioning look that Hizashi ignored. When Minato saw the two brothers interacting, he scowled and sighed briefly before reaching to his left and grabbing the edge of another folder and saying, "I call to the stand, Morino Ibiki, to address the council in regards to the news surrounding the death of the Sandaime Mizukage, and his replacement, the Sanbi Jinchuriki, Yagura." Ibiki Morino's massive body rose slowly from his seat, creating a shadow over the shinobi behind him as he strode out of his place and sat down in front of the Yondaime, where Hizashi and Danzo had been sitting. Ibiki was one of the top leaders of Konoha's torture and interrogation unit because of his intimidating demeanor. Many of his interrogations ended with him simply staring down the prisoner before they started to reveal all of their secrets, whether personal or otherwise, because they were more afraid of the man in front of them than they were of the repercussions of keeping quiet. When Konoha's top interrogator began questioning them, those who weren't intimidated by his appearance soon realized he wasn't acting, especially when they felt every nerve in their body shrieking in pain. However, Ibiki Morino found himself the target of the same critical scrutiny he had given so many pows as he gazed into the Yondaime's frozen pools of electric blue. The man's experience was startling, and a single drop of perspiration dropped from his forehead. Minato stared at the file in front of him for a brief moment before turning his piercing gaze away. "Ibiki Morino, in your report, you established, with a signed and recorded confession, that the Sandaime Mizukage of Kirigakure no Sato has been deposed, executed, and replaced by the Sanbi Jinchuriki, who goes by the name of Yagura." Minato stopped and looked at Ibiki. "Is this inaccurate?" The tone with which the Yondaime addressed Ibiki sent a shiver down the spines of the counselors and current civilian officials. Minato's stance on the subject was made clear by the icy, resentful tone with which he spoke to the interrogator. Ibiki remained silent for a while before saying, "It is not inaccurate, Yondaime. Sama." His coolness and composure conveyed his self-control and discipline under pressure. He discovered that this quality was being put to the test in front of the Yondaime Hokage's piercing gaze. "When did this information come to your attention, and how?" Minato asked, his eyes lingering and appearing to harden as he spoke. Ibiki noticed that the tone of Minato's voice somehow cooled down, yet he responded, "The information in question was acquired from a Kirigakure shinobi that was found during a routine patrol 2.5 weeks prior to today's assembly. The Kirigakure shinobi in question bore markings designating his affiliation with the regime tied to the Sandaime Mizukage of Kirigakure. As I am sure you are aware, the Sandaime Mizukage, in the last 7 years, has initiated several ethnic cleansings within the borders of Mizu no Kuni, as well as called for the brutal purging of several of the native clans of Kirigakure. His motives were tied with a racial superiority complex, as well as a zealous adherent to an unknown cult, which shows disdain towards particular abnormalities, including Kekkei Genkei." Minato said nothing, and he cocked his head in a way that suggested he wanted Ibiki to go on. Ibiki complied with orders. His regime has not gone without conflict. The groups he sought to cleanse, the clans he sought to purge, as well as a vast majority of the shinobi populace who do not share his views, rose up in revolt. For the last 5 years, Kirigakure has been in the midst of a bloody civil war, resulting in a unanimous decision by all coastal nations to cut all trading ties with Kiri. "What does this have to do with the shinobi in question, Ibiki?" Minato asked, casting his cold eyes back at Ibiki. According to the interrogator, the shinobi in question was allied with the Sandaime Raikage's regime, a regime that, according to him, has collapsed due to the death of the Sandaime. He swallowed a tiny lump that had formed in his throat. The council was eerily quiet, but not because of Ibiki's words, rather, it was because of Minato's icy expression. "How did you acquire this information, Ibiki?" Ibiki's gaze paused for a moment before the Kiri shinobi in question was escorted to the torture and interrogation division, where he was subject to questioning. When he refused to divulge any information, he was subject to more forceful methods of information extraction. Minato scowled even more at this, but she said nothing as Ibiki went on. After 7 hours of using more forceful methods of interrogation, he finally began to divulge what he knew. "Why was he subject to interrogation to begin with, Ibiki?" Minato interrupted. Ibiki blinked and then responded quickly, saying, "We speculated that he might have been a scout for a larger force because of his proximity to Konoha, so soon after it had been discovered Iwagakure was beginning to mount an invasion of Hai no Kuni. News of the Kyuubi attack spread to more than just Iwa, Yondaime. Sama." The interrogation was intended to divulge the location of any other contingencies he may have been scouting for. Ibiki waited for Minato to ask him more questions about the situation, feeling the Yondaime's cold stare lingering. He was genuinely surprised that none arrived. Minato ordered, his eyes never leaving the spot, proceed. The interrogator carried out the order. The Kiri shinobi began to divulge what he knew. There was no other contingency preparing to invade Hai no Kuni. He was simply one of many shinobi associated with the Sandaime Mizukage's regime, who fled Kirigakure after his death at the hands of the Sanbi Jinchuriki Yagura, who commanded that all those under the Sandaime's command be rounded up and executed as war criminals. Do you have any evidence to support the shinobi's claims? Minato asked Ibiki as he leaned back in his chair and his eyes finally softened, though they still had a sharp edge. The interrogator let out a deep breath and Ibiki lowered his head, causing a pause before he looked back up and answered. No, Yondaime. Sama, I do not. Minato's stern gaze returned with all of its force. You are telling me that we have been presented with a claim that the Sandaime Mizukage has been slain, that his regime is broken, and he has been replaced by the Sanbi Jinchuriki, and the only source of evidence you have to these claims is the word of a shinobi associated with the Sandaime's regime, am I correct? Ibiki replied, yes, Yondaime. Sama, you are correct, while keeping his eyes fixed on the Yondaime's own. Minato stopped talking and glared down at Ibiki before turning to face Hizashi Hyuga, who was in the council chambers. When the Yondaime said, yes, Yondaime. Sama, the previously mentioned Hyuga got up from his chair. You are being given additional orders. Send a contingency of infiltrators towards Mizu no Kuni. See if you can verify the validity of this matter. If the Sandaime is in fact deceased, and has been replaced, we will need to respond swiftly before Kumo or Yui gain access to this information. If we can respond swiftly enough, we can gain another potential ally, one who might be more willing to negotiate than the Sandaime was. With an acknowledging bow, Hizashi said, as you command, Yondaime. Sama. The Yondaime turned to face Ibiki and said, go back to your seat, Morino.san. Ibiki lingered for a brief moment before slowly rising to his feet and making his way back to his seat in the council chambers. Minato looked back at the dwindling pile of folders to his left after carefully sliding the now closed file to his right. Reaching for the top folder, he opened it and said, I now call to the stand, Jashiro Tanaka, in regards to damages done during the Kyuubi attack. The civilian official got up from his seat, but not a soul in those chambers could stop the groans and flinches that accompanied this announcement. The attack caused enormous losses, and even with a concerted effort, it would take years to repair the infrastructure damage in addition to the fatalities. Jashiro sat down in front of the Yondaime after bowing his head respectfully as he took the stage. As Jashiro managed the majority of the village's repairs and assigned the funeral services for the deceased, Minato noticed that he had a lot of bags under his eyes, indicating that he had not slept well. He glanced at the file in front of him and said, Jashiro Tanaka, according to your report, the casualties suffered during the Kyuubi attack were as followed: 117 jonin, 212 chunin, 95 genin and 11,586 civilians when last counted. Jashiro winced at the last part of Minato's statement. They had recently counted that number, but more civilians and shinobi were going missing every day, and new bodies were discovered every day. Since many people had escaped during the Kyuubi's attack and it was unlikely that they would return, the precise number of casualties from the Kyuubi's rampage could only be determined by determining whether the people who were still missing were discovered dead or alive. At least if they were located. In addition, damages done to the village amounted close to 7.5 billion ryo, and counting. Am I incorrect in this regard? Minato asked as she went on to read the file. Jashiro shook his head. No, Yondaime. Sama, you are not incorrect. The tone of melancholy with which he spoke showed how dire the situation truly was. As it stands, we are still not certain how many are dead, as we are finding the remains of more shinobi and civilians as we sift through the rubble. There are still numerous persons still missing. Whether they fled the village, or their bodies have yet to be found, is still unknown. Yondaime. Sama. He took a breath and spoke further. As we repair the village, we are finding more damage underneath the infrastructure, water mains, electrical grids, and drainage pipes, though not immediately damaged by the Kyuubi's attack, endured great strain from the Kyuubi's rampage, resulting in a majority of the infrastructure having to be replaced. Each day we find more damages to the infrastructure, and the financial burden of this crisis continues to grow. There is just no surefire way to estimate just how much this attack will cost us financially. He grew silent as he took in a deep breath, air in loss of life. He spoke with a tone barely above a whisper. After giving Jashiro a long look, Minato said, How many others are in charge of delegating repairs, Jashiro? In a worried tone. After a brief moment of blinking, Jashiro narrowed his eyes and said, I am leading the primary delegation. though there are 20 other officials who are heading each of the various projects. However, all project management must return to me for verification. Minato sighed. You will appoint 2 others to fill your role, find those who can be trusted with fulfilling your duties. Though I trust your judgment, I do not wish you to overexert yourself and make mistakes. The Yondaimi's tone made Jashiro wince, but he acknowledged it by bowing his head and saying, "As you command, Yondaime." Sama. With a nod, Minato said, "Jashiro, go back to your seat." Jashiro got up from his chair and hurried back to it, letting his head drop into his hands and exhaling softly as he started massaging his temples. Minato closed the file in front of him and opened it, sighing as he glanced back at the files to his left. For an additional hour, this process went on, during which Minato called shinobi and civilian officials to discuss their reports, questioned them, and they provided information. Minato would either give them more instructions or just make sure the report was accurate. As they addressed the remaining pressing issues of the shinobi and civilians, including the construction of a memorial in the middle of the reconstructed mercantile district after the final casualty report was confirmed, Minato and everyone else in the room were clearly exhausted by the end of the meeting. Minato turned to his right, prepared to depart and head back to his wife, who was undoubtedly fussing over their kids, after slowly rising to his feet and saying, "I wish to express my gratitude for the swiftness that this meeting proceeded, and thank you all for your continued service during this trying time." He looked over the current officials and sighed, "If there is no other matters to discuss, then I call this meeting to a close." Yondaime. Sama, if I may interject. He stopped when a shinobi official, the head of the defensive corps, who had been assigned to rebuild the wall around Konoha, got up from his seat. For a brief moment, Minato let his scowl show before gathering himself and turning to face the shinobi official, saying, "Yes, you may." The shinobi official began to cough. "Forgive me, Yondaime. Sama, I know that we are all tired, and many of us already have important duties to fulfill, but I must ask, how did you defeat the Kyuubi?" Conversation broke out in the once quiet chambers as civilians and shinobi started talking among themselves. They had also wanted to know how Minato had vanquished the beast, but they had been too scared or reluctant to inquire. They started expressing their own worries now that the question was out there. With a gleam of irritation in his eyes, Minato clenched his fist and could only frown. He had hoped to wait until the village was more or less stabilized before he revealed that he had been forced to use a forbidden jutsu to seal the Kyuubi into his children, even though he knew he would have to explain how he defeated the Kyuubi. But it appeared that fate had been a cruel mistress today, bringing this problem to the fore where he was powerless to escape it. Minato exhaled deeply and said, "Rest assured, that the Kyuubi no Yoko has been defeated. If any of you are concerned that I destroyed it, you need not worry. I did not destroy it, so it will not reform several years from now, and return to finish the job, as you put it." His voice demanded the silence of everyone in the room. While some shinobi and civilians sighed with relief, others expressed more concern as they processed what Minato had revealed. "What do you mean it was not destroyed? How did you defeat the monster?" asked one woman in particular, a retired shinobi who had been assigned to oversee the orphanages. The rest of the current officials quickly shared the woman's worries, and shinobi, clan head, and elite Jonin all started to demand an explanation for how Minato had defeated the Kyuubi. "I am only going to say this once, so I want everyone present to pay close attention," Minato said, letting out a heavier sigh. "Everyone remain calm, and be silent." He folded his arms behind his back. The worried crowds arguing and questioning abruptly stopped as they focused entirely on the Yondaime, who quickly obeyed their command. "By using a forbidden jutsu in the Forbidden Scroll of Seals, I was able to split the Kyuubi no Yoko in two, separating it from its power, rendering its consciousness and soul inert. I then sealed the Kyuubi's Yuki, and its soul, into 2 newborn children," Minato said, pausing briefly as he looked over the faces of those in attendance, more accurately, my children. The only thing that could match the silence of the chamber's occupants was the subdued expressions of every shinobi, counselor, and civilian official. The stillness and silence were quickly abandoned when a clamor of queries and worries erupted throughout the chambers. "Yondaime. Sama, is the seal strong enough to hold back the beast, even divided? Is it possible for the Kyuubi's soul to overtake the mind of its vessel? Will the beast's power corrupt the mind of the one holding it?" Minato's gaze swept over the faces of the officials who were asking questions. While their questions were reasonable, they were nonetheless annoying. He looked straight ahead and yelled, "Enough," with a growl that accompanied his words. The once inquisitive shinobi and civilians all fell silent when the Yondaime used a single word to silence them all. Not a single occupant was less than taciturn as they gave the Yondaime all of their attention as he slowly looked at them all. Until now, none of them had ever felt so small in their entire lives. "I assure you, The seals that were placed upon my children to hold back the Kyuubi and its power are ironclad. The beast has no chance of corrupting or influencing my children so long as nobody directly tampers with either seal. The Kyuubi shall never again rampage through this village, or any other, so long as the seals remain unblemished through tampering. Minato finally broke the silence, allowing a sense of relief to permeate the chambers. He paused his speech to allow the people in attendance to process his words. My children are the Kyuubi's jailers and executioner, for when they too grow old and inevitably die, they shall take the Kyuubi to the afterlife with them. When the Yondaimi's words reached the shinobi and civilian occupants, they permitted themselves to relax. Yondaime. Sama, would it not be more pragmatic to kill the vessels before somebody has the chance to tamper with their seals? The once calm residents of the council chambers became rigid, and then their disbelieving eyes all turned to the person who had the audacity to make such a suggestion. She was a woman, a Shinobi Corps member, specifically one of the ANBU's Black Ops Corps commands, with her dark hair pulled back in a bun, wearing Anbu armor, and her ninjutsu strapped across her lower back. She got up from her seat to express her thoughts. What? The Yondaime asked slowly, his words as lifeless and hollow as so many of Konoha's graves, his eyes shadowed by his long golden locks and his gaze fixed on the floor rather than the woman. Our enemies may be unable to strike us for now, but how long until they are able to send infiltrators into the village and gain access to your children? It could be years, months, perhaps even weeks, but the fact remains they can still send a small group of their finest infiltrators to enter Konoha, and it would be a small matter to tamper with the seal enough to cause irreparable damage to the village. The woman in question continued to speak, clearly not registering the tone of his words. The other residents of the chambers were torn between looking fearfully at Minato, who had slowly turned his head to face the woman, who was still arguing for the killing of his children, and staring at the Anbu Black Ops commander as though she had gone insane. While you can protect them for now, it is only a matter of time before they respond. It would be more pragmatic to remove the threat of the Kyuubi's return, immediately, before they have the chance to use it against us. Your children will take the Kyuubi to the grave with them. They will be heroes. We will never have to even consider the possibility of the Kyuubi returning again, if we just kill them no awe. Minato Namikaze's piercing glare changed from an icy cold gaze to a raging inferno that would make even the most resilient veterans fear for their lives. The woman who so boldly suggested the murder of his children found herself lifted off the ground, her feet dangling below her, as her throat was crushed. The woman gasped as the Yondaime crushed her throat, and when the consequences of her words finally reached her, she gasped out, "Why?" Yondaime. Sama. In a raspy voice that was all she could manage as she was gradually deprived of oxygen. F. Forgive me, P. Please, Aiya. The Yondaime's gaze hardened even more, and his eyes widened as the Anbu commander's eyes widened. Crack, only for her neck to snap in his grasp, causing her body to go limp. Before he heedlessly dropped their corpse and allowed it to fall to the ground in a heap, Minato sneered in disgust at the miserable filth that had dared to suggest that he kill his children. Fearfully, the other inhabitants stared at the Yondaime as he gradually started to reorient himself before continuing, "I am going to say this once, and only once." As he spoke, the officials and counselors all paid attention to him. His eyes seemed to burn with a deadly fire as they felt themselves shrink as they were looked upon by the gaze of a wrathful father. Any man or woman, shinobi or civilian, citizen or foreigner, who even suggests he growled with as much contempt as his voice could possibly convey, "that I kill my children, will die, by my hands. Is that understood, counselors?" he asked. Every conscious man and woman in the room, including the counselors and civil officials, simply nodded their heads in agreement, while others retorted that they understood Minato's pledge. After a moment of letting his eyes rest on the counselors and civilian officials, Minato abruptly turned to face the chamber's exit and uttered the low, but incredibly loud, order, "Return to your posts, and do not speak of this matter further." He then walked toward the exit and slammed the doors open, making a loud cracking sound as the sound of lumber splitting reverberated throughout the chambers. No one required explanation as to what he ordered to be silenced. At least that's what the majority of the remaining residents thought. Minato trotted immediately, his destination in mind, avoiding passing shinobi of all ranks who had been stationed in the Hokage Tower as he made his way upward to where his wife and children were. This was as the still, fearful but resolute counselors and officials left the council chambers and returned to the streets of Konoha. Recalling the woman's words that had dared to suggest that he kill his children, he felt a weight on his heart. When he eventually found himself in front of the nursery door, where he had left his wife and kids before leaving for the council meeting, it caused him to walk forward with determination and purpose. He let out a slow breath, reached forward to grab the door handle, turned it slowly, and pushed forward as he passed through the threshold. He looked at the picture that was waiting for him, and the weight in his heart seemed to melt away. He could hardly believe that such a woman had married him and given birth to not one, but two beautiful children. His wife, Kushina, was as radiant and beautiful as he had left her, holding the nursing Natsumi to her breast with gentle care. Her violet eyes glowed with such a loving and devoted light, and her features were adorned with a radiant, almost angelic smile. The red-haired maiden noticed him and slowly looked up from where she had been staring. She smiled and said, "Minato-kun, you're back." She slowly got up and held Natsumi to her bosom while the exhausted baby continued to nurse from her mother's breast. Minato turned away, flushed. As soon as she sensed Natsumi stop feeding, Kushina snorted back, "Oh please Minato, it's nothing you haven't seen before." She laughed under her breath and quickly closed her blouse, cradling Natsumi in her arms as she wriggled in an attempt to get closer to Kushina's warmth. As she held their daughter, Minato grinned at Kushina and said, "She's quite fussy isn't she? I hope I didn't leave you with too much trouble while I was away." Kushina looked at the nearby crib, where Naruto was sleeping, curled up under the blankets, and shook her head, saying, "No, honestly, dealing with Natsumi and Naruto myself is not as hard as I thought. Natsumi is far more fussy than Naruto is. I rarely have to calm him, and when he and Natsumi are together she rarely cries as much," Kushina said. When he saw Kushina's eyes start to flutter, Minato's smile only got bigger. "That is good to hear." He paused, then a knowing smirk appeared on his lip. "But I can tell Natsumi is still giving you a run for your money." "That noticeable, huh?" Kushina asked with a sheepish smile on her face as she blinked. With a toothy smile that matched his smug expression, Minato said, "Yep." His tone was devoid of any sense of humility. As Minato reached forward and removed Natsumi from her arms, an act for which Kushina was more thankful than she had initially believed as she rolled her eyes. As he held Natsumi close to his chest, Minato let out a quiet laugh. Then, he looked down at his daughter and smiled softly while running his thumb over his infant daughter's cheek. Kushina watched, unable to control the smile that appeared on her lips. "So, how did the council meeting go?" she asked with a wistful sigh before her smile gradually changed to a more solemn one. A tiny flinch revealed his size as Minato stopped his thumb from stroking his daughter's cheek, turning his smile into a frown. Kushina took notice of his behavior and scowled even more. "Minato?" she asked inquisitively, though her tone was anything but kind. The meeting went well, until the end, when one of the Anbu Black Ops commanders suggested that we kill Natsumi and Naruto when I told them that they held the Kyuubi's power and soul within them, Minato said with a quiet sigh as he held Natsumi closer. Kushina's eyes widened, and then her teeth were exposed as she snarled, "What?" The anger in her voice was only a small part of the writhing rage she felt when she heard that someone had the audacity to suggest such a thing. "Who are they? Where are they? I am gonna tear them limb from fucking limb. Her name will be struck from all records, and her body will be destroyed without ceremony or honors," Minato said, placing a hand on Kushina's shoulder and speaking with a tone of bone. Coldness as he looked up at her. His eyes spoke louder than words. "The matter has been resolved. Even if you made an example of them, it just shows that not everyone will be as accepting of our children's condition as the rest." Kushina's teeth were gradually hidden as she allowed the raging fury inside of her to gradually subside, but the fires of her distaste were still burning brightly within her eyes. With his eyes downcast, Minato said, "That is not the only problem I fear." "What do you mean?" Kushina asked, her eyes whirling in confusion as her gaze snapped upward. Minato turned back to look at Natsumi as he started to walk slowly in the direction of the crib and carefully placed her next to her brother. He watched for a moment as Natsumi reached for Naruto and her brother put his stubby arms around her, keeping her near him. "When I split the Kyuubi no Yoko, I severed its power and soul, and sealed the soul within Naruto, and the power within Natsumi." He reached up to his hair and ran his fingers through it, offering some small solace as he started to express his worries to his wife. "Though, I did not know at the time, but the whisker marks on Natsumi's cheeks are a clear giveaway on who exactly bears the monster's power." "Why exactly is that a problem?" Kushina asked, staring at him befuddled. Minato turned his gaze toward Kushina and continued to. "There are at least 9 known demons that the hidden villages have captured and sealed, creating Jinchuriki, the Kyuubi being the only one that none of the villages have been able to contain since the age of the Shoden, and even he was unable to seal the demon inside a host. Its power was too great, and its will was too strong. But, just because there are only 9 demons, does not mean they have not tried to make use of its power by dividing the source material amongst multiple hosts." The realization caused Kushina's eyes to widen. "Pseudo Jinchuriki?" Minato nodded his head as a grave image crossed his facial features. "Precisely, but every time a village, small or great, has attempted this, it has failed. The fact of the matter is that the Yuki of a demon is simply too volatile, too chaotic for standard Jinchuriki training techniques to work. The Yuki needs a strong willful mind, as well as precise control in order to properly control the Yuki, and the mind of a Biju, strangely enough, has been key in ensuring that a Jinchuriki maintains control over the power, the Biju's mind almost acting like a regulating conduit to prevent the host from using too much too fast. What are you saying, Minato? Kushina scowled as she moved forward and peered down at her kids cuddling up to one another. Minato raised his gaze toward Kushina and let out a deep sigh. Because Natsumi carries only the power, and not the consciousness, she is, technically a pseudo Jinchuriki, and with how much power she has at her disposal, she will have to be trained from an earlier age than usual so she can control it without hurting herself or others. His frown turned into a grimace. I cannot say for certain how much time we will have to devote to her, but I can say this, we will be forced to give her more attention than Naruto so she can control the Kyuubi's power. I will not push one child aside in favor of the other. Minato. Kushina's eyes hardened as she looked up at Minato, a fierce, determined glare marring her attractive features. Her astringent glare made Minato swerve his gaze away from the steely face she bore into his being. He said in a restrained voice, "We may not have a choice in the matter, Kushina." His eyes returned to his children, a regretful expression taking the place of a face that had once exuded such assurance and conviction. Kushina's own piercing eyes grew softer, but she was unable to allow them to completely fade. It felt like she was betraying the very children she had brought into the world by even considering such a course of action, but as Minato stated, what choice did they have? The idea of ignoring one of her children in favor of the other, regardless of the rationale behind the decision, seemed so disgusting. Alright, I don't like it, but I understand. If Natsumi does not have control over her power, then she will hurt herself and others, and we cannot let that happen. Kushina looked down at Natsumi and Naruto, who were so close to each other that their cheeks touched, and she felt her heart break a little as she spoke. As her daughter slept next to her brother, she cupped Natsumi's cheek and lightly dragged her thumb across it. Thank you for understanding, Kushina. I know this can't be easy. Minato's posture softened slightly as a wave of relief passed over him, but sadness quickly followed. Kushina shook her head, saying, "No, it isn't." She slowly closed her eyes and turned to face him, her eyes regaining their sharpened steel gaze as she looked into Minato's eyes. But let me make one thing absolutely clear to you, Minato. The moment that Natsumi has gained full control of the Kyuubi's Yuki, the instance that she is no longer a danger, the moment that she is no longer a danger, you and I will give Naruto the love and attention he missed because of it, and this will not be delayed, not by our enemies, not by our allies, and not by you. The steel edge of her voice sliced through the air like a knife, cutting off any chance of rebuttal, while the resolve in her eyes burned like the sun itself. When Minato reached for her cheek and placed his hand on it, it warmed his heart to see such conviction. Nothing would please me more, Kushina. Time. As Kushina leaned her cheek against Minato's open palm, a gentle smile appeared on her face as her eyes gradually returned to their previous luminous state, the fire and rage gradually being extinguished. Following the cue, Minato closed his eyes and leaned in the direction of the earthborn angel he had the great honor of calling his wife and mother to his children. Yondaime. Sama. Slam. The door to the nursery was abruptly slammed open by an Anbu member who was clearly panting as he attempted to breathe, causing him and Kushina to snap to a combative stance. Fearing that one of their enemies might already be attacking, Minato asked, "What is it? What is happening?" He had neither the time nor the desire to wait for the Anbu to regain his bearings. Riot's counselor did not heed your warning calling for your children's deaths. The Anbu gasped and wheezed out, barely managing to do so as he slammed his fist against his chest and started coughing, citing the lack of oxygen and the forcefulness with which he delivered the news. Minato and Kushina didn't seem to care, as their eyes widened before their faces twisted into angry expressions and they shared a gloomy expression. No one put their kids in danger. The Hokage Tower's exterior. Leagues of civilians and low-ranking shinobi were advancing against a barricade outside the Hokage Tower, which the emergency guard had erected in case of an impending attack. The shinobi, despite their low rank, quickly started to push back after the civilians failed to break down the barricade. The emergency guard repeatedly reset the barricade, but they were powerless to do more than bandage an axe wound due to the overwhelming force in front of them, unless they used more forceful tactics to hold back the approaching crowd. Several platoons of shinobi flanked from behind as the emergency guard fixed the barricade. They were getting ready to jump over it and start suppressing the savage protests as the crowd grew more violent and cried out for the deaths of the infants inside the Hokage Tower, which held the soul and power of the Kyuubi no Yoko. Kakashi Hitaki, the last remaining Yondaime student, was the initial platoon. On my mark, you are to surround the civilians and force them back. Jonin and higher will push through the crowd and restrain the shinobi with seal tags, rendering them paralyzed. Chunin and below will cast a low-level genjutsu to render them unconscious. Once they have been quelled, they will all be restrained via cuffs, bonds, or whatever is available, and they will be escorted to one of the shelters, which will be converted into a makeshift prison until we can. Kakashi stopped talking when he noticed a flash of crimson and blonde in his peripheral vision. His eyes widened as he snapped his head in the direction he saw the twin flashes. Minato. Sensei? He muttered under his breath as he watched his teacher, Yondaime, climb the barricade while Kushina trailed behind him, pulling a struggling counselor in a plain black and gray robe. Kushina's fingers tightened around his graying hair, and her other hand was bound to the sword by her side. Beyond the barricade, the civilians and low-ranking shinobi watched the Yondaime climb it. He gazed at them, and they all fell silent for a moment before Kushina trailed behind him and brought out the counselor, who felt compelled to announce that the Yondaime's children were the Kyuubi no Yoko's vessels. So, this is how my village responds to my decisions, my choices, the very same which has allowed each and every one of you to see the next sunrise, instead of beholding an ash field. You call for the death of my children, solely because you fear a possibility more than you value the depth of the sacrifice I was forced to make to save you? Minato yelled in rage before the crowd in front of him could gather their thoughts and begin to protest violently. His voice pierced the commotion and caused the villagers to step back, as the Yondaime unleashed the depth of his wrath upon them, silencing them as his voice reverberated. The counselor was pulled to his knees by his wife, who tugged on the katana hilt that was fastened to her waist. The edge of the blade made a scraping sound as the metal glinted in the moonlight. Fearing for his life, the counselor started to beg, Yondaime. Sama, please, I swear, I did not know. I felt they needed to know, I beg you, mercy. Sneering in disgust, Kushina whirled the sword's hilt in her hands, holding on to the handle as she swung intently and precisely. Shink. His torso went limp, his head remained suspended, and Kushina held onto his silvery hair as the counselor's eyes widened and a thin line of red appeared on his throat. Seconds earlier, the irate mob that had been demanding the Yondaime's child's death had seen his body tumble over the barricade and flop before them. Only for them to try to separate and run away, exploding in anger and terror. You will be still. As the Yondaime roared again, his steely gaze piercing into their very being, the terrified mob abruptly froze in place, his tone leaving no room for debate or argument. It is clear that despite your eagerness for revenge outweighs any sensibilities you might possess, you have shown me clearly that none of you can be trusted, with your eagerness to murder children simply because of the method I used in order to save you. So, with that in mind, let it be known that the laws I am about to instate only have come to pass because of your actions. He toned down his words again. Henceforth, no man, woman, or child shall utter even so much as a hint that my children possess the power or soul of the Kyuubi within them. No man, woman, or child shall ever raise even so much as a hand against my children so long as I say so, and until further notice, no man, woman, or child shall utter a word of disdain towards my children. The punishment for breaking a single one of these laws is the same. Either I, your Yondaime, or Kushina, my wife, will personally see to your immediate execution. You can't do this, was uttered by a kunoichi in the crowd, who was either conceited or unintelligent. Minato looked abruptly in the direction of the kunoichi. Hugh. Minato's form briefly disappeared from the barricade, and everyone's eyes shifted to the person who had raised their voice. Who would never again speak. After disappearing, Minato reappeared in front of the kunoichi and killed them instantly by slamming a kunai all the way through their throat. He quickly and viciously ripped the kunai from the kunoichi's throat, and the two shinobi who had been by her side fled quickly. He was staring at the Yondaime with fear as his eyes slowly turned to the quivering crowd. You seem to be under the false impression that Konoha is a republic, that it is ruled by the populace, that each and every individual voice holds as much sway. His gaze hardened as he said, you seem to be under the false impression that Konoha is a military dictatorship. It has been as such since the first day of its founding, and it will remain that way until the moment it is dust in the ground, and nothing will ever change that. His voice was quiet and icy, but it was still more terrifying than the roars of rage with which he had spoken to them moments earlier. As though to challenge the crowd to try anything more, Minato turned his back on them. After dropping the head of the counselor who had inspired this mob with his careless actions, he walked toward the barricade, leapt over it, and landed next to Kushina as she was cleaning her sword. He then allowed his headless body to roll over the barricade. As they turned back toward the Hokage tower, Minato took Kushina's hand in his own before the two of them disappeared in a bright, golden burst of light. Just outside the nursery, where Kushina and Minato had been moments before they heard a vengeful mob demanding their children's deaths, the hall was illuminated by the same burst of light. After the counselor informed multiple groups of people waiting outside that their children had become the Kyuubi's vessels, the two quickly responded and located him just outside the Hokage tower. The counselor was dragged to be executed in front of the enraged crowd he had inspired with his loose lips after Kushina grabbed him by the hair. Even though they may have temporarily calmed the populace, they were both aware that some members of Konoha's population, who were more skilled than low-ranking shinobi and civilians, would attempt to target their children in some ill-conceived plot of retaliation. In light of this, Minato grabbed the nursery door once more and turned to face Kushina, saying, "We will overcome this, Kushina. No one will harm our kids." After giving him a quick glance, Kushina turned away and said, "They will still try, and we won't always be there to protect them." In response, Minato nodded his head. "I know, but for now, we can keep a close eye on them, and train them to defend themselves. We will already be devoting too much time to Natsumi to make sure she can control the Kyuubi's power. How will we be able to make sure both her and Naruto are trained? They won't just be going after Natsumi, they will go after our baby boy as well." Kushina snapped, her words laced with venom, and Minato felt the sting of it more than any other kunai. With a dejected expression on his face, Minato lowered his head and said, "I know. They were already in a difficult situation and were in danger, but now their children were even more so because one counselor did not see the importance of keeping quiet. Both of them required constant protection, or at the very least, training, but how could they accomplish the former when they were already being compelled to spend more time with Natsumi to ensure that she maintained her composure? I may have a solution to your dilemma." A familiar voice and the distinctive clacking of wooden sandals against the tiled floor caused Minato's and Kushina's eyes to snap to his left. Jiraiya, the Gamma Sennin and Minato's teacher, was walking toward them with a big scroll under his arm and the same self-assured smile he always had. When Minato turned to face his older master, Jiraiya Sensei, his lifeless expression appeared to brighten, if only slightly. "Minato. Oh, my apologies." Jiraiya halted in front of Minato and bowed in a dramatic pose. "Yondaime. Sama." He looked over at Kushina and said, "And the illustrious and beautiful Kushina. Sama as well." As Minato's hand edged towards his pocket with the hilt of a kunai just barely protruding, his once bright eyes darkened. "Do not push it, Jiraiya Sensei." "Oh Minato, you don't have to worry about me," Kushina said with a laugh. The left eye of Minato twitched as she said, "Not you, I'm worried about my love." Now Minato, don't be too quick to react, not until I show you my gift to you both." Jiraiya laughed and got back up from his bow. His face became more serious and he said, "I think my goddaughter will appreciate it even more." He took the scroll under his arm and held it out to Minato. Minato took the scroll and started to unravel it slowly as his eyes grew softer and a curious expression crossed his face. Over Minato's shoulder, Kushina saw an inscription appear on the scroll, followed by numerous seals. But what drew their attention was the inscription. "Pseudo Jinchuriki." With a tone that was almost demanding, Minato asked, "What is this?" as his eyes quickly turned upward and met Jiraiya's. As he watched Minato and Kushina's reactions, which ranged from pleased, joyful, to suspicious, Jiraiya nodded his head in the direction of the scroll and said, "You can see for yourself. That scroll contains all the documents, files, and techniques that I have been able to acquire over the last month, thanks in no small part to my information network, spies, and double agents within the borders of the other 4 major villages, and to Kigakure." He raised his hand and said, "A small gift for my goddaughter." "When did you get this, and how did you get it so soon after the Kyuubi attack?" Kushina asked him, her eyes narrowing and her pupils' dilations demonstrating her skepticism and wariness toward this gift. Jiraiya's grin turned into as soon as I heard what Minato did, and saw the babies, I knew Natsumi was a pseudo Jinchuriki. From there, I simply had my information network infiltrate the village archives and find anything relevant to pseudo Jinchuriki, and had the deliver copies to me. How can you be sure they didn't give you false copies to throw you off, Jiraiya Sensei? Minato asked, her face hardening. Jiraiya's eyes flashed with a tone Minato hardly noticed, and his smile faded. Minato scowled more and said, "Jiraiya, please don't ask me that." Jiraiya looked away for a moment before turning back to face them, revealing a tone of regret and vulnerability that both Kushina and Minato found surprising. "Just to know that I made sure the copies were genuine, and leave it at that, please." Although neither Kushina nor Minato were happy with his response, they both understood that they would not benefit further from him. Kushina once more spoke up, "Even if the copies are genuine, how do we know that the villages didn't place decoys and hide away, or even destroy the original copies?" Jiraiya rested his head on the scroll held by Min. There are too many similarities in the various files and techniques used to train Sudo, Jinchuriki, and the other villages do not really have a close enough relationship to fake these files as well as they did. I know it's circumstantial, but based on the fact 3 out of 4 of those files have such glaring similarities for how Sudo, Jinchuriki are trained, then I think we can presume that they are the genuine article. It almost seemed too good to be true, a way to teach their daughter how to use the Kyuubi's Uchiha, but Minato's eyes shifted to the scroll. Her training might be accelerated significantly as a result. Whether it had any effect on the Kyuubi or any other Sudo, Jinchuriki. And what if it doesn't work? What if none of these techniques help Natsumi control the Kyuubi's power? Kushina raised, expressing the same worries. Jiraiya shrugged his shoulders and said, then you know what not to do to get her to control the Kyuubi's power. His smile darkened. Although they both knew it was the best response they would receive, it was not the response they had hoped for or even desired. With a bow of his head, Minato closed the scroll once more and said, Arigato, Jiraiya, sensei. With a 100-fold smile in return, Jiraiya exclaimed, oh come here you, before leaping forward, putting his arms around Minato, squeezing him, and raising him off the ground. The Yondaime gritted his teeth and his eyes were wide open. Grrrn. He managed to growl as Jiraiya's tight and confining hug crushed his ribs. Jiraiya and Minato were left out in the hall as Kushina opened the door to the nursery and entered, the latter barely controlling her laughter. She took the katana from her waist and carefully placed it next to the crib, out of the way while she cared for her infants but close enough to grab in case of an emergency. She glanced down at Naruto and Natsumi's sleeping bodies, the latter of whom was cradling his sister, who was shivering a little in her slumber, with his arms slung across her side. Even as her face contorted in pain, Kushina frowned softly and smiled slightly as she reached down and carefully lifted Natsumi, carefully unlatching her from Naruto. She took a seat in a chair close by and started humming a gentle melody while rocking Natsumi back and forth in her arms. Minato and Jiraiya entered the nursery as the door slowly opened, and they both fell silent when they noticed Kushina humming to Natsumi while holding her close. As her arms extended and pressed against Kushina, Natsumi's face buried in Kushina's bosom, gradually losing its displeased features. Minato slipped forward, trying to keep quiet as he knelt beside Kushina and gazed at his daughter with the kind of devoted attention that only a father could provide. When Jiraiya saw the happy couple holding their daughter, he grinned. It seemed like such a simple thing, but among the elemental Nashinza, especially Shinobi, such an image was extremely uncommon. It was a comforting sight, and for a brief instant, if only briefly, he forgot the worries that awaited him outside the tower. It was such a sweet scene, but the 3 shinobi's attention was so focused on the jubilant light shining in their eyes that they failed to notice the twisted features on the face of the baby still lying in the crib, clutching at the blankets around him, his sister no longer where she should be. Naruto. The infant whimpered while writhing in the crib, but as he cocked his head to his side, his features appeared to lessen their discontent. Naruto. The infant's innocent, youthful gaze shifted to the ceiling as his features appeared to soften and he gazed up with innocent curiosity. The nursery's ceiling, which separated it from the rest of the cage tower, was silent, but the baby's attention was still fixed on it. Or rather, the reason for it. Naruto. The pipes and mortar that separated the nursery from the rest of the tower were situated beyond the ceiling. Interestingly, a large vault that was situated in the upper parts of the cage tower was situated above the nursery as well. Naruto. Since the day it was forged, so many decades ago, the vault's doors stayed closed, its seals remaining intact, and its old steel remaining sturdy. Naruto. The power of the demon that had attacked the reliquary that housed its prison in the quiet, lonesome cries of a newborn boy were enough to awaken an ancient stone inside. Naruto. It had been almost a year since that fateful day when Minato woke up from his coma and had to murder people from his own village who he had once referred to as friends or even allies. But if a father didn't defend his kids, what good was he? Following the execution of those who had called for the death of his children, he ensured that any potential opposition or traces of those who had demanded the head of his offspring were promptly apprehended and put to death like the rodents they were. He showed no mercy, and anyone with any kind of authority who thought it prudent to propose his removal or to consider the possibility of his children being killed for the good of the village, including business and guild masters, was swiftly dealt with. He made sure they all kept in mind that Konoha was a dictatorship, not a democracy or a republic, and that he was the one who created the laws here. However, Minato's kindness paled in contrast to Kushina's brutality and immorality toward those who demanded the heads of her children. The first people to experience her wrath were those in the mob that fateful evening. Their homes were marred by the blood of those who were killed by Kushina as slowly as possible, making sure that everyone in Konoha could hear their cries. Then came those who questioned her tactics, arguing that she had overreached herself in murdering those who posed a threat to her children. The coroner who was responsible for identifying the remains disagreed, but they had a cleaner death. Even when talking about hypothetical pragmatism, the last were Shinobi, or those who had been in the crowd and had agreed with the sentiment that her children's deaths were a good idea. None of them were spared by Kushina, and many people wondered if she had actually killed those Shinobi before whisking them away in the night and hiding them in a dark dungeon where she made sure none of them ever died and none of them ever grew accustomed to the suffering she inflicted. Although no one was brave enough to investigate the source, the cries of pain kept many people awake at night. No one could ever verify it. No one in Konoha was immortal, and only an immortal would have such bravery. When Minato and Kushina burned Konoha to the ground for their children, the people of Konoha indeed, all of the elemental nations learned a valuable and deadly lesson within a year. They loved their village, and it made many nations wonder what they would do to them if they even thought that their children were harmed. In this regard, even the daimyo had been hesitant to confront Minato. The daimyo was forced to change his ways and pay much closer attention to his children, who had recently become less independent, after reading a faded letter written in an unsettlingly red ink. It had been months since anyone had last seen the daimyo's children leave the palace grounds, and now the samurai guards were under constant observation, with a far stricter code of discipline ingrained in them. Anyone could see who the real master of Hai no Kuni was, both in terms of function and name. Consequently, Minato's only worry was how to raise his kids. As things stood, they had already started the process of making sure Natsumi wouldn't succumb to the poisonous power her father had stored inside of her. As Minato held their daughter, a string of paper seals attached to her, Kushina studied the scrolls Jiraiya had given them. The vivacious one. Year-old had to have them put back on after she started tearing them off and playing with them, tearing them apart and creating confetti. Even the surplus he had made was running low, and he only had so many of them to work with, so Minato had been forced to make a variety of replacement seals, which did little to help him right now while his daughter was awake. However, it had helped Natsumi's body adjust to the Kyuubi's power. According to the scrolls Jiraiya had given him, the Kyuubi's essence had to be filtered through the bodies. Without the soul, the Kyuubi's Yuki would start destroying the host cells until the body shut down. This could take months or even years, but it would eventually happen. The strategy they were employing appeared to be the most successful in limiting a Biju's power, enabling the child to develop resistance to it. They used what they determined to be the most effective number of seal tags required to suppress Kyuubi's power sufficiently to allow Natsumi to develop resistance to it, however, because this method had not been applied to anything with the level of power that the Kyuubi possessed. According to what Jiraiya brought us, Natsumi should only have to wear those seals for under the assumption our calculations are correct. Kushina said, looking back at the scroll, as she gazed up from the scrolls to her husband. We should probably keep them on for an additional month just to be safe. Minato grinned at his wife. Or, would that affect her growth as well? He asked. The most it says is that puberty will be delayed, but beyond that I don't know, Kushina said, glancing over the scroll. Minato swore, Kusoa, and Kushina gave him a scowl. Minato, watch what you say around the kids, she yelled. Kushina, she isn't going to repeat every word Minato sighed deeply. Kuso! Exclaimed Natsumi abruptly, laughing and waving her arms. Kuso! 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 When Minato sensed Kushina's icy stare on him, he fell silent and said, Iya. She put down the scroll and started to flex her fingers as she stalked in his direction, saying, put Natsumi down and start running. After putting Natsumi back in her crib, Minato complied and said, Now Kushina, I know I messed up but. You have 5 seconds for Athrea. There's my little angel. Kushina leaned down and picked up Natsumi from her crib, smothering the young girl with kisses. Yes she is. Yes she is. She cooed as she held her daughter to her bosom. Minato wasted no time in leaving the room abruptly, much to her amusement. Minato was only concerned with avoiding Kushina's wrath as much as possible. He had no idea how far or how quickly he had run. But at last, as he looked around, he stopped, gasping for air. Only now did he realize he was still in the Hokage tower as a drop of sweat trickled down his brow. Oshi! Yandaime! Sama! When Minato saw his predecessor standing in front of him, he exclaimed, Ga! And turned around, crossing his arms over his face. Please not the Hiruzen? He asked. Let me guess, you said something that Natsumi or Naruto caught onto, and now Kushina is livid? The elderly former Hokage asked with a smile as he glanced at Minato. Was it really that obvious that Minato's face curled into a downcast position? Hiruzen shivered and leaned in to whisper, I still get phantom pains after what she did to me when Asuma started smoking. Not all of my battle scars came from war, Minato. Some of them were given to me by my wife when I had said a few too many things to the children. Didn't he only start smoking a few? Minato blinked. As he started to walk, he said, matter of factly, phantom pains, Minato. But enough about my children, tell me, how are Natsumi and Naruto doing? He asked, favoring his right side. As Hiruzen waited for a response, Minato fell silent and put his hands in his pockets. Natsumi is well, though we have had to spend day and night watching over her in the off chance our protocols for the Kyuubi Yuki fails, but beyond that she is well. Naruto on the other hand, Minato said in an eerily silent tone. As he considered how he hadn't been there for his son as he ought to have been, Minato's mind was racing with ideas driven by guilt and self-loathing. Even though he had good reasons, the pain of self-loathing for not being the father Naruto needed persisted. Similar to him, his wife was constantly looking for ways to spend as much time as possible with both of their kids. He was not granted this luxury, but he hardly had time to tuck his kids in because of Natsumi and his responsibilities to the village. Without saying anything, Hiruzen said, Minato, you're doing your best, nobody can fault you for that. All Minato could do was snort, maybe I should start doing the best of somebody better. At the Yondaime's mocking remark, Hiruzen scowled and said, putting yourself down won't fix this situation. Looking at Hiruzen, he said definitively, no, perhaps Noda. But perhaps it will encourage me to do better. Was that all you wished to speak to me about, Sandaime? Sama? He asked. Shaking his head, the elderly Sarutobi scowled and said, no, I actually came here to report some news to you. And what is it that required you to come see me yourself, instead of sending an Anbu or one of your clansmen? Minato asked, crossing his arms and raising one eyebrow. It is about a certain cult with which we are both quite familiar, said Sarutobi, his head turning to each side and his chakra briefly flaring before his eyes shifted to Minato's. The Zakarum? Minato asked, his eyes narrowing, but it was more of a request for confirmation than a question. His predecessor murmured, yes, it is. I fear that we may not have been as thorough as we anticipated in dealing with them previously. That damn cult is like a nest of cockroaches. Do I need to burn the village's foundation for us to be rid of them? Minato asked harshly as he started to march towards his office with Sarutobi following him. His fingers curled into fists, and his pupils dilated as the veins in his neck started to pop. A new religion, called the Zakarum, emerged 2 months after he awoke from his coma. They preached a lot of fantasy, which had drawn many residents of Konoha and Hai no Kuni toward them. It was said to have a straightforward doctrine, to believe in the worship of the light, and to follow these instructions. The light is present in all living things, regardless of race or origin. Embrace the light wholeheartedly. Have faith in the light's glory because its power surpasses all in the mortal world. And resist all evil. Presumably straightforward, but its adherents were zealots who held the final 2 doctrines with such rigor that it was impossible to engage in dialogue or negotiations with this religion. No one, not even the daimyo of Hai no Kuni, could force them to stop disobeying Minato's orders or the laws of Konoha. They were so devoted to their 3rd tenet that they considered it to be evil to submit to any mortal authority. At this point, the 4th tenet, resist all things evil, it became problematic. The Hokage, the daimyo, the fire temple of Hai no Kuni, and Konoha's laws were all considered evil and deserving of destruction, which is exactly what they did. The riots had started out as property destruction, but within 2 weeks they had escalated to murder and more serious crimes. The cries of those the Zakarum had decided to spare were still audible to him, but not out of tenderness. What they had done to them was worse than death. As the cult raped and pillaged their way through the residential districts of the capital and Konoha, as well as the countryside of Hai no Kuni, the Zakarum had primarily targeted women and children, as well as those who were unable to defend themselves. Although there had been a huge number of dead, there were nearly 3 times as many injured and broken. The cult then focused on the fire temple, where the bloodthirsty cult had massacred the monks in training, killing 2 elders and a number of other priesthood members. As a result, there was an order to give no quarter, and to execute all remaining cult members immediately. Their scriptures and teachings were to be burned, their artifacts destroyed, and their remains disposed of right away. They believed they would eradicate the last traces of this cult after a month. Where are they located, Sandaime? Sama, and who amongst these cult members survived? Minato asked with a steely edge, contradicting Hiruzen's statement. Hiruzen sighed. That is the difficult part. It isn't members who came here that are our concern, it is the converts that have been popping up recently. What? Minato growled, his eyes turning to steel, and he fell silent. To the visibly incensed Yondaime, Hiruzen started to explain, it would appear not all of the Zakarum artifacts and scriptures were destroyed. Some were saved by would-be converts within our own forces. It was one thing for members of the original cult to convert his citizens to the cult, but it was quite another for his forces to voluntarily decide to reform the cult. This would give them much more legitimacy than they had previously had because his forces made the decision to reform the group rather than being coerced into joining it, as the original cult had done. Minato's blood froze as he heard those words. Adherence to its doctrines would follow along with that legitimacy, and they would be forced to start over. However, this time, it would be more challenging to eradicate because its popularity had grown through choice rather than coercion. The ensuing conflict will weaken Konoha, and then our enemies can simply swoop in like vultures and pick us clean. Minato whispered as he started to pace back and forth. This could lead to a civil war. He looked at Hiruzen, who had been identified as reforming the cult, saying, "If we can deal with them now, we might be able to prevent further catastrophe." Hiruzen stopped talking and turned his head away from Minato. Hiruzen glanced back up at Minato, who demanded, "Well, Minato, I only have one name, it's my oldest son. He is the one who saved the scriptures and artifacts." The Sandaime flinched as he saw the concentrated rage radiating off of Minato like a tsunami crashing upon the shores, and he could not blame him. Minato's eyes glowed with rage. "What?" he roared. First in line to assume the role of clan head of the Sarutobi, Hiruzen's son was a charismatic man who could easily convert neutral parties into sycophants and turn adversaries into allies with his words. His speeches would enthrall and inspire, holding a crowd's interest for hours. Minato was furious to learn that someone like that had been reorganizing such a company. "Minato, please The killing intent of Minato was so great that Hiruzen felt his bones start to creak under the weight of his rage. Did your son not see the carnage and devastation this cult brought with them? Was he so regaled by his own reflection in the mirror he didn't see the corpses littering the streets, or the children that the Zakarum had mutilated? Answer me, Sarutobi." "Minato, I came here to ask for your help, my son." Minato yelled to his right, "Your son is a traitor, Hiruzen, and will be treated as such," and started to make his way to the Hokage Tower's exit, but Hiruzen grabbed hold of his shoulder before he could make it to the stairs leading to the entrance. "Do not get in my way, Hiruzen, I will not," Minato retorted, snatching Hiruzen's hand and twisting it behind his back before slamming him against the wall. As Minato's desire to kill him slammed into Hiruzen, he practically pleaded, "Please, Minato, just listen to me. My son can still be saved, please. I am begging you. There has to be another way." After scowling, Minato released Hiruzen and crossed his arms before ordering, "Speak." Hiruzen touched his wrists as he spoke. "My son has only been able to make a handful of duplicates. The original copies are still with him. If you can acquire these scriptures and the copies, as well as those he has converted, then your problem will be solved. He is the only one who has any copies that I am aware of. If you can stop this now, you likely will never see the Zakarum in High no Kuni again." Squinting, Minato said, "You still haven't given me a reason to spare your son." "Minato, please," scowled Hiruzen, "he is my son. He is also a traitor, one who would have pushed Konoha into a civil war the likes of which would have destroyed this village. Tell me, Sandaime Sama, why should I spare him when anyone else I would already have them on the execution block by now?" Hiruzen pleaded with Minato in a low voice, saying, "I am not asking as the Sandaime Minato. I am asking as a father, please spare him." Minato turned away from Hiruzen and looked at the ground, but he said nothing. The Sandaime kept staring at him the entire time, and then Minato inhaled deeply and started talking. "Your son will be interrogated by Ibiki and Inoichi immediately, after we have gotten the information we need from him, the location of the items as well as the names of those he has converted. I will have Inoichi wipe his memory. He will be removed from the Shinobi Corps, never to be reinstated. His chakra will be sealed, and he will never again be allowed into any form of office with power over another. If he attempts to unseal his chakra, if he attempts to re-enter the Shinobi Corps, if he holds any power over anyone aside from his children, I will have him executed. You will not tell him why. You will order him to accept his new lot in life. That is all I am willing to give you and not an ounce more." He turned to Hiruzen, his eyes hard as his voice pierced Hiruzen like 1,000 needles. "Is that understood?" Although it was framed as a question, there was only one correct response. With his head down, Hiruzen muttered, "Yes, Yondaime Sama, I understand." Glancing back at the head of the Sarutobi clan, the blonde shinobi turned away and strode to his office, saying, "See that it is done, Hiruzen. Do not delay, not even for a second, or the deal is off. And no, I am not joking." He needed to prepare for execution. After a few minutes, he was at his office doorway, pushing it open as a glowing seal confirmed his identity and locked it. He hurried to his desk and started taking out a pile of documents right away. He retrieved his chair, took a seat, and grabbed a pen. only for something that shouldn't have been there to catch his attention. Or, more accurately, someone. None other than his son was standing in front of the office vault, tilting his head and staring silently while still wearing his onesie. Looking at his son, Minato hurried to his side from his desk and exclaimed, "Naruto? Naruto, how did you get in here?" With his eyes fixed and his hand pointing to the door, Naruto blinked and said softly, "Open." Minato frowned. If Naruto was able to enter when he wasn't there, it would seem that he needed to fix the seal on his door. According to all accounts, Naruto shouldn't have been able to enter, but since he had both his and Kushina's blood flowing through his veins, it appears that the blood seal registered him. Jiraiya was supposed to be watching him, but his eyes hardened as he lifted him. He shivered as he thought about the fury his wife would inflict on him if he taught Naruto how to curse. He lifted him into his arms and sighed, saying, "Come on Naruto. Let's get you back to your mother. I have words for your godfather you really shouldn't hear." His son's expression was emotionless as he left his office, looking over his shoulder with his little hands cautiously reaching for the vault. "Naruto," the voice continued to murmur in his ears, despite the fact that the door shut behind them.
That's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this great story. See you in the next one.